Great. Do you want to kick off then? Go ahead. Just we have 20 people now here. Do you want to tell us what you want to give us an introduction? Tell us who you are, and tell us about what your basic thesis is.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. I don't normally go out of my way to give my lectures to Christian groups, at least this particular one, though I have given it to several different Christian groups. Before I get started, I kind of want to say, just kind of point out the obvious and say, if we were talking about Mormons today and you were in my position, how would you go about saying to your audience things that they don't want to hear? Because I know with pretty good confidence that none of you are really down with the idea that there was no Jesus historically at all. And so I just want to preface everything I'm saying today with, I'm not saying this to be a dick. I'm not saying this to attack you. I'm just saying this because this is the way it seems to me to be. This is the way the historical evidence seems to fall in line for me. I am a big old atheist. I'd love it if you all turned atheist after this message. But if my talk makes you a better Christian, and you being a Christian makes you a better person, a happier person, and better to people around you, I'm delighted with that too. So I don't want you to take anything I say as an attack against you guys. So that said, maybe I should just start with my deconversion story. I was raised Southern Baptist, and just long story short, I used to flirt with this one girl in college by having theological arguments with her. And I would always give the standard evangelical Christian view of whatever we were talking about. And she would always give some hippy-dippy response of whatever she's talking about. And one day we were going at it, and she says, "Well, Dave, the Hindu religion is like 3,000 years older than Christianity." And I was all set to jump down her case. And before another word came out of my mouth, I realized, I have no idea if Christianity is older than Hinduism or vice versa. And it was at that moment when I realized I was about to say something that I didn't know if it was true or not. That hit me like a ton of bricks, and I thought, oh my God, I'm just like the Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. I'm just parroting back what I was taught all along. And that moment shook me up more than any other argument I'd ever had with any non-Christian before. And that realization. And from that moment on, Christianity never felt true to me at all. It just seemed obviously fake. And that's a conviction that's only grown more in the years since. But for 16 years, I was a perfectly content atheist who believed that there was a Jesus. It never even crossed my mind that there was no Jesus. And what made me become a mythicist finally was after 2 years of initially becoming curious to know how much in the Gospels is what Jesus really said and really did, and how much of it was just legendary mythology that was added on later. And again, going into it, I just wanted to sort out the real information, the real evidence of the real Jesus. I didn't even know there was scholars out there who were doubting his historicity at all. But again, long story short, about 2 years after that, I started thinking, I don't think this guy existed at all. And I was so delighted to find out that I wasn't the only person saying that at the time. There was Earl Doherty, there was Robert Price. That's in a nutshell. I could talk about that for a long time, but I think you'd rather hear, let me keep it open for Q&A. And if that's not right, let me know. And I can at least give you a little more bare bones of my thesis, which is not my thesis, of course. I'm just feel like a combat reporter reporting from the trenches. But
do you want to just give us a nutshell idea of basically your arguments in support of your contention that Jesus didn't actually exist as an historical figure?
Gotcha. Well, the book I wrote, Nailed, breaks down top 10 ways that I feel like the official story of Christianity fails. One thing for me that it kind of all boils down to in a nutshell is that there's this paradox that either Jesus did all these amazing miracles, or at least taught all these amazing things, and no one outside his religion noticed for the better part of a century, or he didn't do these things, they were just attributed to him, or these teachings were attributed to him, and yet as soon as he's Instead, you've got all these feuding little house cults scattered not just in Judea and the Galilee, but all over the Roman Empire that can't agree about the basic facts of his life. And for me, that one paradox alone is just a huge red flag that the official story of Jesus is not what we think it is. Where's my book here? I've got nailed here. I'll just run through the table of contents real fast and just touch on a few things. The top 10 things I had was, A, that the idea that Jesus was a myth is ridiculous, which is, I still get thrown in my face all the time, especially from atheists. And again, I don't normally make this case in front of Christians. I make it in front of atheists. And this is still very controversial, even in most atheist circles, though I'm glad to say it's not as controversial as it was 15 years ago. Myth number 2 was Jesus was wildly famous, and yet as soon as you start pressing anyone for evidence, they say, oh, but there was no reason for us to take notice of him, or anybody to take notice of him at the time. Number 3 is that the ancient historian Josephus talked about Jesus, and I spend a lot of time on that because he's really the only non-gospel witness we have to Jesus that corroborates anything on the Gospels on the face of it. Eyewitnesses wrote the Gospels. That's something that's really not even that controversial in biblical scholarly circles anymore. The Gospels give a consistent picture of Jesus. That's something that I argue that just looking at them is very different from not just the way they portray Jesus and his personality, but the way they answer crucial questions like, when he was born, when did he die, why was he arrested, why did the Jews have him crucified by the Romans. Myth number 6 was that history confirms the Gospels, and myth number 7 is archaeology confirms the Gospels. And in between those two chapters, I also get into textual criticism and the question of how much we can trust what's written in the Gospels. Number 8 is Paul and the epistles corroborate the Gospels. Because one of the things, this is an important one, because one of the things that really struck me early on is how different Christianity is before Mark writes his Gospels in the 70s and after Mark writes his Gospels. 9 is Christianity began with Jesus and his apostles, and it's the myth behind that is that the further we go back into Christianity, the more variegated, the more ramified it is, and the more we get these different groups that we can barely even recognize as Christian. And number 10 is Christianity was totally new and different from everything else that was around at the time. And I touch on just some of the evolution of it from other existing religions at the time, particularly the mystery faiths. And the last chapter I have before the wrap-up is called Can Jesus Be Saved? And I talk about all the things that would be different in early Christian history and in the New Testament if there had been just a mere mortal Jesus like we get presented to us from secular biblical scholars. That said, now that book is done, I talk a lot in that book about what I don't think Christianity was, what wasn't true about early Christianity, but I never actually go on to talk about what I do think Christianity looked like. And that is why I'm writing a new book, and then about 3/4 of the way done with that now, called Jesus, Mything in Action. And it talks about things like, why aren't more biblical historians on board with this theory? What would it look like? Where do our Gospels come from? What are our sources for Jesus? Because one point I really want to stress that whether mythicism is right or wrong, whether Christianity is right or wrong, whatever anyone tells you about anybody in ancient history, really, not just Jesus, but since we're talking about Jesus, anyone who wants to say anything about Jesus, you have to ask them first, what's your source for that? And for us, ultimately, they boil down to the Gospels, and the Gospels ultimately boil down to one single gospel that seems to be an allegory from start to finish. And that's sort of my 5-second, my elevator pitch in a nutshell, if you will.
Great. Does anyone want to kick us off with a question or comment? We have Thomas has his hand raised. Let me promote him to panelist. Hey Thomas, I've just unmuted you, so go ahead.
Okay, great. Can you hear me all right?
We can.
Just barely, Thomas.
Okay, how about now? Any better?
Oh, that's better.
Okay. Of course, I share the same point of view with you, but I do have another question which I haven't heard answer, which may help with a wider range of understanding this with the group that's here. The caveat is, if there was an actual Jesus, what period of time or what actions would you place him at being in that historical area? Thank you.
That's an interesting question, because part of the problem we have with the Gospels, as you probably well know already, all of you probably will know, is that we don't have any solid dates for anything in Jesus's life. His nativity in Matthew and his nativity in Luke, and those are the only two that give us a nativity time frame, are 10 years apart at the very earliest. His death, if the Synoptic Gospels are right, it would have to be during the year 31 or 33. If John's right, it couldn't even be the same year at all, because they all have him dying on a Friday, but John has him dying on a different day than the other ones do. And you can extend this throughout the Gospels. Every single thing that we have any kind of time frame for in the ancient world, we know when Cleopatra put the asp to her breast. We know when the Vesuvius erupted and destroyed Pompeii. We know the time and afternoon it was, and yet we don't have a single date that we can nail down for Jesus. And it was even worse for the ancient world, because when we read the writings of early Christian fathers, they couldn't agree on how old Jesus was when he died. They couldn't agree if he was killed under Pilate or Pilate or of Claudius or of Alexander Jannaeus. These are hundreds of years apart, you know. There's this tremendous lack of specificity and corroboration on every single date in Jesus's life. That said, just knowing what we knew about Judaism and the way they were interpreting messianic prophecies and apocalyptic prophecies, everyone was expecting a Messiah around the first third of the first century, around the same time that we don't just see Jesus, but we see 10 or 15 other preacher figures who were also trying to cash in on that messianic fever at the time. And I talk about them in the book as well, the new book.
Cool. Great.
Thanks, Thomas.
Anyone else want to make a comment or a question? Just raise your hand or let me know in the chat window, and I can upgrade you to panelist. We have a hand raised from Hillary Ferrer. Sick. Hey, Hillary, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
I see a very shadowy figure. That must be Hillary.
I know. I'm sorry. It's like I've got the window behind me.
If that is your real name in the eyewitness program.
It's not blurred out. But oh wow, that's
Uh-oh.
sorry. We've got some major feedback going on right now because we've got this on the TV as well.
Now I definitely know you're in the eyewitness protection program.
It's my fake voice. We were just. I'm sorry, Blake, fix that.
I'll mute.
Okay. Okay, there we go. I fixed it. Okay, we were just wondering what some of the sources were that had Jesus dying under the different. I can't remember the ones that you listed.
Right. The easiest answer for all these kind of questions about where my sources are is A, let's look in the book, or B, look in the book when it comes out, because otherwise I'll be flipping through pages and it'll be a very boring chat room, even more boring than it is now. It was, if I remember correctly, the ones who were saying he was under Claudius was some early church fathers. I want to say it was Origen, or perhaps, don't quote me on that. Some early church fathers that I'll be mentioning by name in the book and showing in their writings. So
the other people, it was Claudius.
One group was saying under Claudius, another group was saying under Alexander Jannaeus. Actually, the Jesus that we see in the Torah, that's one of them, where they split between things that happened 100 years after the fact and things that happened 100 years before the fact.
Did you write that down? Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Hillary.
Okay, great. Let me put you back to.
And I don't want you guys to take anything I say on my word for it. I'm not asking that. I get that. It's just, bear with me. It's just, there's so much stuff to this that I have to look it up myself,
Yeah. Let me put Hillary back to viewer, and then you can go back to your big screen. Okay, so we have a hand from Wesley.
Hey, there's Wesley.
Wesley, go ahead.
Hi.
Hey.
So I'm curious in terms of your dating. Sorry, the statement about the dating in the Gospels. I know Bart Ehrman, I've heard him a few times bring up Luke chapter 3.
Yeah.
Where it has the, I believe it's
under Quirinius.
22 historical references in verses 1 to 2. In the 15 years of reign of Tiberius Caesar, it also mentions Pontius Pilate, the governor of Judea, Herod of Galilee, his brother Philip, Tetrarch of Itria, and it goes on. And it has those 22 verified historical statements that Bart Ehrman himself has brought up. I'd also like to hear what your own personal interpretation of Bart's statements.
Well, it's not an interpretation. What I'm saying is he does mention historical figures, and there is mentions of things that are happening and events, but we don't know when these are meant to have happened. Was this in the such and such year of was it in the year that Quirinius did the census? Well, if Matthew's right, it couldn't possibly be, because he's saying this was during Herod the Great's reign.
Right.
Who died 10 years earlier than that.
Right. So
and so that's what I mean is we don't have any one part of the Gospels at all where we can say, oh, that happened on such and such a day, and we know that for sure.
Okay.
Part of the problem with that is that the Gospels don't agree on the time frame at all.
Right. So the reign of Tiberius and Luke is dated to 29 BC. Sorry, that's my mistake. John's ministry is dated Tiberius to 29 BC, and we have this pattern in Old Testament writings of dating an occurrence or a person by the powers of the day. So, for example, Isaiah and Isaiah 1:1 and Hosea and Micah, they all mention the leaders before they mention the actual occurrence of event.
And I take your point, but what I'm saying is they're talking about events that we do have dates for.
Yes.
But the dates don't work with the story they're giving us. For instance, Luke is especially bad about this, and I think it stems from his use of actual historians at the time. And I'll give you an example of that. During the book of Acts, shortly after Jesus' trial, he has famous Rabbi Gamaliel coming to Paul's defense. And talking about, well, this is just like when Festus gave his revolt, and he gives that story. Right. Only that happened 10 years, 15 years after that. That's an anachronism. Luke is taking the information he gets from somebody like Josephus, but putting it in the wrong format. And he does that a lot, which is a lot of the ways that we know that it's Luke stealing from Josephus and not the other way around.
It's Luke stealing from Josephus?
Exactly.
Even though
window dressing for historical touches.
Okay, Josephus wrote quite a bit after Luke did, though.
No, he didn't, actually. You're right that Josephus wrote late. He wrote that book in 93 or 94, the Jewish Antiquity or Jewish War. Right. But Luke, and we can talk about that, because the dating question is one that's seriously argued back and forth between the secular scholars and the religious scholars. Right. For me, just the fact that he's taking information from a book that Josephus wrote in the year 93 or 94, means that that's the earliest possible date you can get for Luke. And I agree with the scholars who date him more closer to the year 116 or the 120s or even the 130s.
Okay, I don't know of any scholars dating it that late. I know the quote-unquote liberal scholarship within secular. The latest date that I've ever heard was between 90 and 110. And
I can see with 110.
Right. The general consensus within that I've read, this is my field, the early Christian period, is 80 to 85 at the latest.
But again, and my response to that is with the scholars who point to this is Luke borrowing from Josephus, therefore he could not have written it before 93 or 94. So those dates are right out the window.
Okay, so you start with Josephus and then go to Luke?
Right.
Okay.
And the reason I say that, and I'm not just telling you that as a Ten Commandment from on high, you can see it for yourself. There's a great article online, Luke and Josephus, that Carrier has done, where he talks about Steve Mason's analysis of this.
Right.
It's if he didn't borrow from Josephus, you're shaking your head and smiling. I think you have read it before, have you?
Yes, I have. Yeah.
So you're not impressed with it?
No, I'm not.
Then you have to explain a high amount of coincidences to make me agree with you there.
Okay.
And again, the dating is one of the most seriously controversial things between secular scholars and liberal scholars. I mean, I should say between believing scholars and non-believing scholars.
Right.
So maybe we just agree to disagree at the end of the day.
Okay, sounds good. My other question would be in terms of, because I mentioned Bart Ehrman, what you would say to him when he's very clearly stated that by adhering to a Jesus mythicist theory that you're handicapping your ability to perform historicity.
Well, I do talk to Bart Ehrman, and we don't agree about that.
Okay.
Well, you have probably read his book, Did Jesus Exist?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Me and my fellow mythicists, we didn't dislike that book because we expected he would agree with us.
Okay.
But what we expected was that it would give the best defense of the historicity.
Right.
And clear out the deadwood for all the crappy mythicist theories out there. Because just because somebody's a mythicist doesn't mean I agree with them. Anybody who tries to tell you that Christianity was invented by the Romans or by Josephus, it's like, I have no time for you at all.
Okay.
Zeitgeist. I have serious problems with Zeitgeist.
Right.
So that's it. And but the interesting thing I found was in his second book, From How Jesus Became God,
mm-hmm.
he backs away from a lot of things that he cites as just kind of phones in as, oh, this is a settled thing. Everyone agrees on this. And he's realizing that the consensus on a lot of these things about Jesus, especially, is not as ironclad as he was led to believe. And I went through about 100 pages of his new book before I disagreed with him on anything.
Right. The new book in the new one that came out a few days ago, or
no. This is from Jesus. How Jesus Became God.
Okay.
The one he wrote right after Did Jesus Exist?
Right.
Have you read his book Forgery and Counterforgery?
Yes.
That book blows my mind. That's the Bart Ehrman I like to root for. The
right.
one who has really has pulled the curtain on biblical studies and shown how much of it is.
Yeah, I'm no defender of Bart Ehrman. I just was wondering what your
Tell me, what's your biggest problem with Bart Ehrman? Because I know a lot of Christians don't like Bart Ehrman.
Right. I've studied textual critical issues at the graduate level, and my main issue, although this is getting a little bit off topic on what discussion is the way he presents the evidence. Mm-hmm. I think he, especially with his whole, more variance per words argument, I think is very misleading.
Well, I take your point on that.
When you take a look at the variance and you study, the difference between meaningful variance and non-meaningful and viable variance.
And I have to say, I agree with you. And I make that same point in Nailed, that we're not worried about grammar mistakes. We're not worried about spelling errors and things like that.
Mm-hmm. But the way he presents his information, that's the main. I also have a problem with him continuing to assert that he's an historian and not wanting to make direct theological statements. But I think he makes very clear theological statements in a lot of the stuff that he writes. And I think it's because he's opposed to the biblical version of Christianity that he was adhered to before he became an apostate.
Gotcha.
So that's sort of my quandary with Bart is that he's at one point trying to say, no, I'm just a historian. I'm not going to make theological statements. Then he weaves in all these theological statements into his books. Now, I think he's a very valuable scholar, especially for textual criticism. And I think every Christian who's involved in that field of biblical studies should definitely take him into consideration. But I think he's a very poor theologian, if that's the way.
That's probably true. That's the problem with Jesus studies in a nutshell, is that there's this interwovenness between the theological and the historical, and
Right.
it's hard to not step on the toes of one or the other, you know.
Right. Okay.
Let me just, since I got you in the hot seat now, let me just throw some questions at you and ask you what you think about the historicity of biblical figures.
Okay.
Do you think Adam existed? Do you think Moses existed? Do you think Abraham existed? Noah, do you think Noah existed?
Yes.
Yeah, I have a serious problem with that. Yeah.
Okay. And I think because I'm starting with the position of inerrancy, because I'm starting now, I don't say this as I came to a position in my life where I differentiated my faith from my parents' faith very profoundly. There's a lot of things that my parents believe that I wouldn't necessarily believe.
Gotcha.
And within that study, now Old Testament isn't my field.
Gotcha.
But as a Christian, I'm not a Marcionite. I'm not going to throw it out the window.
Well said.
And I won't speak authoritatively on a lot of issues pertaining to the Old Testament because I'm a New Testament early Christian period guy.
Sure.
But yes, I would say that those are historical figures that existed within a time frame.
Yeah. I mean, I always try to be very careful about assuming I know what Christians believe.
Right. Right.
Because
that's a good thing to do,
Because it is tough, and you can't put two Christians in the same room and be assured they'll agree on anything.
Right, especially with the Old Testament scholars. You get 3 Old Testament scholars in a room, and you have 5 different opinions, right?
For sure. Yeah. I have no further cross-examinations of you.
Good, great, thanks. I appreciate that.
Good talking to you.
Okay, let me go to Tim. He had his hand raised. Let me unmute Tim. Go ahead, Tim.
Hi, David. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Right.
I had you, then I lost you, Tim.
All right, trying again.
Oh, there you are. Hello. Hi, Tim.
Hello. Hi, good to see you, not in the flesh, but at least virtually. You've made a lot of historical claims about Luke in particular, and about contradictions between the Synoptic Gospels and John.
Yeah.
So here's a difficulty that I face. I think everything you've said is historically false and can be shown to be historically false without any assumption of inerrancy or inspiration, but just on the basis of the kind of assessment that we would give to secular historical documents. I think you're wrong about saying that Luke dates the birth of Christ 10 to 12 years later than Matthew does. I think you're wrong about saying that Luke has borrowed something about Gamaliel from Josephus, and I think you're wrong about saying that the crucifixion in John is on a different day from the day it's on in the Synoptics. Now, you've been doing this for a while, so you have to have had some pushback from people who have said, wait, Fitzgerald, you're all wet on this. But I have your book, and I've read through it, and I haven't seen any interaction with the answers that have been given to those challenges that you've made. So I am wondering how you would back up your claims if you were to be interacting with some of the answers that have been given to those kinds of challenges.
I appreciate that. And to be honest with you, Tim, I haven't heard anybody who's said anything that's made sense of the difference between the Synoptics and John.
Okay.
No one has given me any kind of pushback on that I've taken seriously at all.
Right. Okay.
And I say that saying, I don't remember anybody asking me any pushback on that, saying, look at this. It's always been the other direction. Me saying, well, this is the last couple of weeks of Jesus's life according to the Synoptics,
right,
more or less in agreement. This is what John has him doing. And I'll give you an example of that. Lazarus. Lazarus is the reason that Jesus is arrested and sentenced to death in John. Lazarus doesn't even exist in the Synoptics except as a fictional character in one of Luke's parables.
Okay, so are we making an argument from silence here?
How can we make an argument of silence when we're just comparing what it's saying? This isn't silence.
Okay,
this
well, it's one thing. Hold it, David. Hold on.
Okay.
It's one thing to say they don't mention Lazarus.
No, I'm not saying that.
Lazarus doesn't exist, as though they said, now, there never was some guy named Lazarus, let's get that straight. It's a
Well,
very different thing.
Don't they though? Because the context that we meet Lazarus is given in a different context in the Synoptics, and there is no Lazarus. There, it's the house of Simon the leper. There is no Lazarus in there. The same thing that introduced
He's unmentioned.
has been taken from the Synoptics, but out of context.
He's unmentioned.
And what's more, the Synoptics have their own reasons for Jesus being arrested. They have nothing to do with Lazarus.
Well, David, slow down. Okay. We're dealing with a methodological issue here. You're trying to raise a kind of argument, and you make this kind of argument systematically through Nailed. Now, by the way, I have the 2010 edition of Nailed. Is there a later one to which I should be referring, or is that okay?
No, yeah, you're good.
Okay, right. If you try to see what happens with arguments from silence in secular history, they fall apart.
What silence? What silence are we talking about? They're giving different reasons that don't agree with each other.
Okay.
And they get throughout their story.
So
This is not an argument.
I picked 3 points.
Okay.
One of them, which you had brought up in your run through your chapters, and if you want to talk about something else, we can do that. But I was interested in 3 things.
Let's hear it.
That Luke places the birth of Jesus at least 10 years after Matthew does.
Okay.
The charge that Luke has borrowed something from Josephus in his reference to Gamaliel in Acts chapter 5, and the charge that that John places the crucifixion on a different day from the day that the Synoptic Gospels place it.
Okay.
And if you don't want to defend any of those claims, we can go somewhere else.
No. I'm happy.
Am I wrong about the fact that those are 3 claims you've made?
I'm happy to. I stand by all 3 of those.
Okay. So in Luke chapter 2, where Luke is talking about Quirinius, why does he use the Greek verb agenita rather than the simple past tense ein?
If you're going to go down that rabbit hole, we're going to be here a long time. We know Quirinius did that. And we know who was in charge of Syria before Quirinius.
Right. I agree with that. I completely agree with that.
Okay. There is no room, and no one disagrees that I'm aware of, that census he's referring to took place in 6 or 7 AD.
Right, but when did the enrollment for the census take place?
Sorry?
When did the apographe take place? Apographe is a word that has 2 meanings. By metonymy, it can be used either in its strict sense as a registration, or by metonymy as the census or the taxation that's carried out on the basis of the enrollment, the registration. Now, there's a long-standing interpretation that says that Herod the Great fell out of favor with the emperor, and we know he did. And the emperor wrote to him. Josephus gives us the quotation in Antiquity 16, saying, "Heretofore I have treated you as a friend, but now I'm going to treat you as a subject." We know that there was an oath of loyalty to Caesar that people were required to sign on pain of paying a fine. But we also know that Herod adroitly got back into the emperor's good graces. Now, this interpretation, which is many people have put forward, but you're not engaging with, says that the enrollment started, the sign-up, which is the prelude to any taxation, because the taxation power was taken out of the hands of Herod, but that when he got back into the emperor's good graces, that was halted. And it was only ultimately when it came to pass that Quirinius was governor, because Archelaus was kicked out for mismanagement, that they actually picked up and carried through on the threat to do a Roman taxation. Now, I can cite authorities for you. We can look at the specific.
I have another question for you instead.
Yeah.
Okay. Taking all that at face value, whether that's true or not, what you're saying, you're talking about this interpretation. This interpretation is very plausible. But what that forgets is that Galilee was not part of the Roman Empire at that time. It wasn't until it went from being a client kingdom to being directly run that any kind of taxation that you're talking about would have applied to Galilee at all.
Okay, I think you missed the significance of what I said.
And no,
right? If you look at Antiquities, book 16, Josephus tells us that Herod fell out of favor with Augustus, and that Augustus wrote to him in anger and said, "Till now I have treated you as a friend, but now I am going to treat you as a subject." One of the things which client kings in good standing had as a perk of being in that standing was that they were able to carry out taxation themselves rather than having Rome come in and carry out that taxation from the outside. Now, the theory that is being propounded here,
And that is a theory.
right, is that this was that kind of occasion.
And as far as speculation goes,
I'm not quite done, David.
That's
all right?
true. Perhaps
I'm not quite done.
But it remains speculation. What we know
I'm
is
not
that
done, David. I'm not done.
Okay.
We can check on whether this is true because we know that if there was an enrollment, which would be the first step in a taxation, someone would have had to sign an oath of loyalty to the emperor on pain of paying a fine, a rather substantial fine.
Go on.
And we actually have a record at that time. There was a group of Pharisees who refused to pay the fine. The wife of one of the client kings of another region or a nobleman of another region actually stepped in and paid their fine for him and was accounted among the righteous because she paid the fines of these Pharisees who refused to do it. Several thousand of them. This is all in Josephus. So there's actually an independent data point there.
Again, we're going to have to agree to disagree on the ramifications of what you're saying.
Okay, but the point that I'm making is this is a pretty well noted interpretation with a lot of people.
And the reason you're saying interpretation and not fact is because we just don't know.
But you are claiming we do know and that there's a contradiction.
Well, I'm claiming that, and again, apologies for this not coming out in nailed, but the Galilee was not part of that taxation at that time. Whether it was a client king or not, there would be no reason for anyone to go to Nazareth from the Galilee.
Now, that's a different question. Why would someone go to Nazareth or from Nazareth to Bethlehem if there was a taxation? But the question of whether, as a kingdom, it had the right to carry out its own taxation is not settled by its being a client kingdom. That depends on its being a client kingdom with a king in good standing with the emperor.
And if your problem with me is a undue sense of certainty about that statement, then I take your point, and I take your point.
Okay, I would be happy to share with you references, hyperlinks, things where you can go and chase this down for yourself.
Great.
So after this is all over, I'll ask Jonathan to give me some information. We'll go and chase that down. How about now this Gamaliel thing in Acts chapter 5?
Let's talk about that, because that seems a little harder for you to shake off.
Yeah, I'm really very puzzled by that. Can you lay out the argument for me just very clearly again? I might have missed something about the way that you were putting it.
It's an anachronism. Gamaliel in that speech is talking about something that happened over a decade, if not 2 decades after that time it's purported to be. It's not the only anachronism that we see in the Gospels. It's not even the only.
How is it that Gamaliel is supposed to be saying something anachronistic? So I'm looking at 530.
He's talking about a revolution that hadn't happened yet in the past tense. He's mixing it up with another one. That's part of the reason we know the mistake he's made is because he's mixing it up with an earlier revolutionary.
How do you know he's mixing it up?
You can read the book, Tim. You've read it.
No, I have it in front of me. I see the claim. I hear the assertion. I'm looking for the argument that there. I mean, Judah. Variants on Judah are some of the most common names.
Go ahead.
Variants on that name are some of the most common names. There were, as Josephus himself says, thousands of people raising up revolutions and protesting things. I just don't.
They're not thousands, but yes.
But I'm just saying what he says. Or I think he says 10,000 others. Okay. Yes, it's hyperbole, right? But
I think you're mixing up with the Zachari. You're mixing up with the numbers of the Zachari. But
no, actually, I'm not.
The article that I steered Wesley to, Luke and Josephus, that he's not very impressed with, I think you will also not be very impressed with. But that is what
I've read it, and I'm not. And
fair play to you. If you're not impressed with it, you're not impressed with it.
Yeah. I would strongly suggest that you get a different source for ancient history than Richard Carrier. That's just a friendly piece of advice. But
I don't. Okay, you can. We should have Richard Carrier on the show. Actually, you would have a good time with him. But the point is, I don't say this because Richard Carrier says it either. I don't say it because Steve Mason says it. I say it because I look at their arguments and I
Mhm.
find them convincing.
Right. Unfortunately, all of their arguments depend upon their forcing Gamaliel to be referring to someone that it's not at all clear he's referring to. That's the
He
problem.
mentioned him by name. I don't see how you can say that.
Wait, you say it's the same name, and therefore, have you looked at Tal Ilan's name
He's
list?
taking two different revolutions, conflating them.
I realize that's the charge. I don't see the argument for
you
that.
could do that for every single argument in there, that if he's not borrowing from Josephus, well, then it's an amazing coincidence, and these things keep adding up and up and up. That, well, that's another amazing coincidence, that he just happened to do the three that Josephus did in the exact same order. It's, and again, if you don't find that convincing, that's fine. I'm not here to convince you.
Yeah, I just don't think the coincidence is really there.
Convinced. That's all.
Yeah, I don't see the coincidence at all. I think that that's invented rather than being found in the text. How about the third point, the point about the Gospel of John and the Synoptic Gospel?
Let's do.
Right, John, you say, puts the crucifixion on a different day from them.
That's right.
Can you give me, because I don't want to put words in your mouth here, give me your own understanding of the reasons for thinking that?
Yes, and they are all written and nailed in the chapter that talks about this.
Right.
Where he is saying that Jesus was crucified on the day of preparation, where the other ones are vice versa. One is three of them say he was crucified on the day of Passover, and one of them says the day of preparation for Passover, or vice versa.
Right. Now, here's a really important point, and this is very widely done in. Oops, I just had my window go very small on me. There we go.
You're good.
This is something that's very widely discussed in the New Testament literature. The word preparation, there is no phrase that says this was the day of preparation for the Passover. It says it's got a genitive. It's got preparation of Passover. Every time preparation is used in the New Testament, and widely throughout Josephus, it means the day before the Sabbath. It's preparation for Sabbath. Paraskue is still today.
Well, hang on. Let me stop you for a second there, Tim, because it also talks about the Feast of the Unleavened Bread. And again, this is not Dave Fitzgerald making this claim. There are plenty of biblical scholars who have recognized that there is a problem between here.
Right, but there are also plenty who have said they're just wrong.
My assertions.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. It's like saying Easter Sunday, right?
I don't agree.
All kinds of Sundays, but some Sundays are special. Okay, no, I'm trying to explain the position to you. Right. I realize that to maintain that there's a disagreement between the Synoptics and John, you have to disagree.
Well,
I understand that.
No. I don't have to do anything, because it's not on me to maintain a disagreement. I'm not doing this because as an atheist, I'm obliged to shit on the Bible. That's not my job. That's not my interest.
Right. Okay.
And I don't feel necessary to go down every single rabbit hole when some of them are so much more obvious to me than others.
Okay.
The instance of Lazarus thing to me is so much more blatant.
Okay. I picked three that you had mentioned.
Right.
Okay, so I'm trying to keep focused on those three and to explain to you how it could be that someone who does not approach the text with the assumption that it's inerrant, who is trying to look at this as we would look at secular historical documents, might disagree with what you have claimed about those three things in particular.
And I'm fine with that. I have no problem with the disagreement. But what I'm saying is, if you pull out three of these things and say, therefore, we can see that he's been doing this throughout, you can't say that with all the discrepancies and the contradictions between the Gospels. You simply can't. And
that's a subject for a different discussion.
Well, okay.
Right now,
there's always going to be another argument. There's always going to be another rabbit hole. And it feels like no matter how much I talk about this, and I've been talking about this for 16 years now, someone always says, well, this, and that, and speculation, this. And when I point to my sources for that, they say, well, I don't agree with that. And it's like, at the end of the day, that's where we agree. That's where we disagree. And honestly, I don't know what to tell you. At the end of the day, we disagree about that. And disagreements happen in historical circles all the time. That's nothing special.
Right, I agree. Let me just ask you one question about John 18. When the rulers and chief priests are bringing Jesus before Pilate,
Mhm.
They don't want to enter into his quarters.
On the thing that they will be unclean.
Right. And
Right.
what is the specific thing that they want to be able to do?
Well, Hyan Cohn actually argues that there's nothing that would prevent them from entering Pilate's domicile that would make them unclean.
I understand that. But what I'm asking is, in John 28, because the question is not whether Hyan Cohn's interpretation is right. The question is whether John is placing this on the day before the Passover Seder, right? The evening meal.
Okay, you've read the book, so you know I've got the passages where Luke and Matthew and John all make these specifications.
And I'm going somewhere very
this
specific.
This is not Dave Fitzgerald talking. This is biblical scholars talking.
Right, and I'm trying to point out something that I think that some of the biblical scholars you're depending on may have missed. In John 18:28, the claim, whether John is right or wrong,
I'm with you.
the explanation he gives is that they want to be able to eat the Pascha, the Passover.
But he doesn't say that, does he?
Yeah, it says because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. That's a direct quotation. I'm looking at this right now in the NIV. Would you like me to look it up in a different version?
Well, actually, I do prefer many other versions to NIV.
Tell me what you like.
Revised Standard Version. But let me just take your point for a moment. Let's say I agree with everything you're saying about the timing of John, and take the time to go back, and it all checks out. And at the end of the day, I agree with you.
Sure.
Fair play to you if that happens. But what I expect is going to happen is I'm going to say, in the middle of that, I'm going to be saying, now wait a second, what about all the other contradictions? What about all the other, not just, Matthew says he was wearing a red t-shirt, Luke says he was wearing a blue t-shirt, but the basic incompatibilities between all those gospels and the synoptic problem. You've got to be aware of the synoptic problem. I wouldn't. That alone, to me, is a huge indication that we're not dealing with eyewitnesses. Not that they claim to be eyewitnesses or write like eyewitnesses, but that we're talking about gospels that are all derived from a single one. How do you feel about that theory? Because I think that's a much bigger issue.
I think that is demonstrably false on the basis of dozens of different pieces of evidence that is absolutely impossible responsibly to say that we have only one source, and that is Mark. That is just absolutely not a starter. That's not going to work.
And again, this is why I don't bother having these arguments with Christians, because at the end of the day, we're not going to agree about that. And I don't see, if you don't recognize that, you don't see that Matthew is taking Mark's story. Matthew, a non-eyewitness, taking the story of another non-eyewitness, even though one's attributed to being a disciple, one's not.
David, you're surely aware that Matthew has material not found in Mark. Material that can be historically corroborated by cross-checking not only with other gospels, but also with non-Christian history.
Wait, no, stop. That's what I don't know. The corroboration with other gospels and the corroboration with non-Christian history, that's not what I find.
Okay.
That's not what I found with Matthew. That's not what I found with Luke or Mark.
I think you need to get out
or
there.
John. Again, this has been delightful, Tim. This has been. Let me ask you this. Do you believe the Bible is inerrant?
I don't care.
You don't care if the Bible's inerrant?
No.
You don't care if
I think
do you think the Bible has any falsehoods or mistakes in it?
I don't know.
That's a remarkable position to hear. Are you a Christian? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth or anything.
Yes.
Does it matter if it has mistakes in it? Does it matter if it's a human?
Not if the mistakes are such as we could attribute to the ordinary sources of mistake in human testimony, inadvertence, inattention, and are not significant enough, as you said, not just red shirt, blue shirt, but significant enough to affect the substantial message. It might be the case that they have small mistakes here and there, and we could still, as we do with Tacitus, trust the majority of what they say because they have shown themselves trustworthy in other ways. That's where we have it.
I love what you just said. Because they've shown themselves trustworthy in other ways. Because that's
right.
when anyone's making any claim about anything in ancient history,
Yeah.
what is the corroboration for it? Is there any corroboration for it? How much do we trust that?
Right.
By that standpoint, all 4 of our Gospels do not hold up very well at all, even by ancient standards.
So having read your book, I have to say, I think you are exactly wrong about that. And I think that if we take maybe the 50 or 60 things that you bring forward in the course of that, there are maybe when we throw out things that are trivial and we throw out arguments from silence that clearly shouldn't carry much weight, we're left with maybe 5 or 6 that deserve investigation. And I've tried to pick 2 of them here. I didn't expect you to try to bring up the Gamaliel Acts 5:1 here, but for the other 2, the census and the date of the crucifixion, I think when we do that investigation, they dissolve under investigation.
Well, I disagree that they dissolve.
I understand,
I
but I think
agree that maybe they don't matter at all in the swing of things. I'm more disturbed by things like the timeline that we get for the Passion from the Synoptics and Mark's and John's, those 2 polar opposites of Gospels.
I don't think they are polar opposites. There are a few difficulties in there.
A few is putting it very lightly.
Yeah, but I think that's all you're going to be able to sustain when you really get down to the details.
All right.
No, I understand that's where we disagree. Okay, and that's fine.
Right. Well, here's the
I'm
thing.
just trying to explain to you how it.
Down, but I feel like we are putting everybody else to sleep in this conversation for starters. And B, let's talk about this more. If you or anybody else wants to talk to me, my email is everybodylovesdave@gmail.com.
I love it.
Again, I don't expect you to like what I'm saying. I don't expect you to agree with what I'm saying. Historians don't agree with each other all the time. What I want to do is I want to make the best argument I can. You can help me make that best argument or discard it. And I have discarded arguments that don't pass the reality test. And half the time it's a Christian who's pointed that out. And so you could do me a serious favor. You could even convert me to Christianity, back to Christianity, perhaps.
Well, I don't think I can convert anyone, but I might be able to make some arguments that might help along the way.
And again, I think the exact thing from the other side.
Okay. I see Hillary's got a question that she's putting up. I'm going to go ahead and mute out now and let some other people do something.
Okay.
I appreciate that, Tim.
Thank you, Tim. Chris wanted to ask a question next. Let me unmute Chris. Chris, do you want to go ahead?
I'll let Hillary go first.
Oh, you want Hillary to go first? Let me put Hillary first then.
Thanks, Chris.
Oops, one sec. You're still muted. Okay, you're on. Sorry, Hillary, you were muted there. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, David, you were saying how you thought the New Testament documents just weren't a very good example of ancient corroboration and very well attested. Can you tell me what documents you think are better attested and would be a good example of?
Yes, I can. I mean, pick just about any ancient historian you want, even the ones we think are kind of shitty historians, like Tacitus and Suetonius. They could be really horrible rumor mongers, at the best of times. But what they would do that the Gospels never do is they would tell us, well, this is our sources. This is how much faith we have in what they're saying, what they're not. If they have multiple sources, they would cite, also this site over here is saying this. Also, they have physical evidence to back up their story. What they're saying is corroborated on other lines of evidence besides just their say-so. In every single way that you can have physical evidence, that you can have evidence to corroborate a historical claim, the Gospels usually have none of them. And the few that they do have is not the best kind, but the worst kind. It's anonymous historians who don't claim to be eyewitnesses, who are falsely attributed to be eyewitnesses, saying things that are not historically, they're not showing any kind of historical criticism of their sources or telling us what their sources are or when they're borrowing from each other.
Okay. So
and the things they're saying don't add up to what we know from other sources.
So you're saying it's basically their lack of sources within their texts and their
Not at all. It's the way It's not just that. That's one.
I said, and the lack of that their sources, if they do say it, are completely non-academic sources.
There's multiple problems. For instance, Luke claims he's the only one that claims to be writing history, and yet he has taken the bulk of his gospel from Mark, and to a lesser extent from Matthew.
Okay, so
isn't that what part of good
And he
history-
also claims to be writing in a time when so many people are writing gospels that he says it seems to me like a good thing to investigate from the beginning and see what was handed down to us. So right from the beginning, we know that's not Luke, the guy who hung out with Paul. This is a later Christian saying that things that were handed down to our generation, they're investigating.
Well, yeah, I mean, he says.
And then he's taking the bulk of his story from Mark and expanding on that.
Well, just like on that point, I mean, so it doesn't seem like Luke is pretending to be someone else, an eyewitness himself. He's saying,
"Oh no, I agree.
So,
none of the gospels are claiming to be eyewitnesses."
Okay, so just to follow through with that, I mean, because are you accusing him of dishonesty then when he says,
Yes. "Oh yes, I am."
So, like, a first thought would be, if he was going to be dishonest, wouldn't it make a lot of sense for him to present himself as an eyewitness, or the gospel that he's passing along as being written by an eyewitness?
Well, he claims to be giving us the real story from the beginning. So in that sense, he's claiming that he's drawing on eyewitness accounts.
But wouldn't it
And
be
he claims he's the only one out there doing it too.
Wouldn't it be better for him to have just flat out said, look, I'm an eyewitness of these events. Let me relay them to you. And instead he's doing something a bit further back and not as ideal for apologetics.
Well, we do have Christian writers in the New Testament who did do exactly that. The writers of the epistles of James, the epistles of Peter.
Just focusing on Luke for now, he did a far less ideal thing, a modest thing, in not presenting himself as an eyewitness.
Maybe he thought he couldn't get away with it.
Or presenting the gospel as being written by an eyewitness.
He didn't do that. Well, but he does claim to have investigated the matter thoroughly.
Right, which is less ideal, especially in ancient history, where you wanted to preferably be an eyewitness yourself.
We're agreeing, but I don't see the point. You're saying because he could have done it better, it means he was honest, and that doesn't add up.
No, it doesn't entail it. But I mean, it is one point in consideration. But yeah, and so yes, hold on, wait a second. Real quick.
It just occurred to me. Later editors of John also claimed that it was an eyewitness that wrote John. That's tacked on. The ending's been tacked on.
Yeah, just going back to what you said earlier, you made it sound like almost a complaint that he was using Mark, but isn't that kind of suggesting that again he's seen trying to be responsible with his sources? I mean, isn't that kind of what historians would do?
Well, no, because they would say, as Mark says, and of course the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are stuff that were attributed to them in the 2nd century. Originally, they weren't just all anonymous, but they were the gospel according to, not the gospel by so-and-so. And that it implies a tradition and implies that these are an ongoing school of thought,
I'm not sure if it's true, though.
No, it is. I'm not saying that. In a speculative way, that's the convention at the time, was to say the gospel according to so-and-so.
You say it's absolutely true. I don't know if you knew what I was about to refer to. I
was saying you were saying about the you don't know if it's true about the attribution. Sorry.
Yeah, that historians always say according to so-and-so, especially in a context situation where a lot of the readers would have already been familiar with Mark. I don't know if he needed to.
We don't know that either. Mark ends his gospel by saying the women went around and told no one, and implying, and that's why nobody's heard this story until now.
I don't think that that's what that implies. I don't see why that would follow. But I mean, that's a different topic.
Why do you think he would contradict all the other gospels by saying, "Oh, and they told no one"? I
think that was a reference to basically they didn't talk to anyone on their way to.
That's not what he says. That's not what he says. In fact, that's where the gospel ends originally. It ends at that verse, and they went away and told no one.
Well, I mean, it's like, when Jesus healed that individual, and he said, go straight to, the priest and talk to him. The idea was don't talk to anyone on your way. So I think a pretty natural interpretation, and that was right in Mark. And so a pretty natural interpretation is when the angel says, go report these things to the apostles, you wanted to give a sense of urgency, this sort of laser-directed.
But that's not what he's saying. That's not what the angel tells him, them.
David,
You mean
David,
In
can
Mark.
we read Mark 1? In Mark 1, you have a very similar literary device where it says, this is the cleansing of the leper. He says, and a leper came to him, imploring him, and kneeling, said to him, if you will, you can make me clean. Moved with pity, he stretched out his hand and touched him and said to him, I will, be clean. And immediately the leprosy left him, and he was made clean. And Jesus sternly charged him and sent him away at once, and said to him, see that you say nothing to anyone, but go, show yourself to the priest, and offer for your cleansing what Moses commanded for a proof to them. But he went out and began to talk freely about it, and so on. So you have the same situation, a similar situation in the same gospel.
With all respect, you don't have the same situation, because originally that verse is where the gospel ended. It was, and the women went away and told no one, the end. And those verses 9 through 20, they were added hundreds of years later, dozens of years later, tens of decades of years later. We don't know when they were added, but we know those weren't the original ending.
There's also the slight problem that on your interpretation, somehow Mark found out this detail even though the women told no one, and that raises the question, how could Mark have figured this out? So it's an even worse in a logical situation if you try to put that interpretation on it.
You could use the same thing and say, how does he know what Jesus is saying when he's praying in the garden and no one hears him? You could say that for all the Gospels. You could say, how does Matthew know what Joseph was dreaming or what Mary was pondering in her heart? It's because
there's a difference. There's a difference because in those cases, he didn't say no one told anyone. You could have discerned, maybe when Jesus was appearing afterwards, then he got the information from here or there.
But as I said from Hillary, the reason we're playing this guessing game is because they don't say that. He doesn't say these are my sources, and according to so-and-so. I mean, even later bullshit Catholic stories that come later, they are really careful to cite their sources, even though they're saying ridiculous things like, when a dove came out of Saint, so-and-so's death and his glorious martyrdom, and they opened his heart and had Jesus written on it. They're stupid, goofy stories, and yet by that time, they're on board with, no, we have to have a good, solid base for this. That's not the case when Mark's writing his story.
Just to draw a quick difference for this one argument I'm making.
Okay.
In those sections that you're bringing up about Mark, and you're asking, well, where could he have gotten his source? Mark never implied that I could not have gotten this information from anyone. Whereas in the case of the empty tomb and the women fleeing, according to your interpretation, he's doing something radically different. He's actually saying, there's no one that could have gotten this information out to me from. So that means that on that interpretation, you're actually attributing something highly, highly irrational to Mark. I think that's one consideration against the.
And again, this is dueling interpretations, because I don't think it's illogical for what he's saying, because what his purpose was, as I see it, was what he says in Mark 4:11, that I am giving you a parable of the kingdom of God. This whole gospel I'm giving you is a big meta parable. And in the new book that I'm writing, I go verse by verse throughout the Gospel of Mark, mostly focusing on Mark, with some side trips to the other synoptic Gospels and to John, and talk about how every single thing that happens, even the structure of the things that happen, the timing, that scholars have said, well, this is clearly Mark's own invention, this didn't really happen this way, is a literary choice. And the things he's saying are all echoes of what you get from other mystery religions, what you get from the Old Testament, what you get from writers like Philo of Alexandria. And again, none of you guys are going to agree with that at the end of the day, but right. That's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
Okay, so, and let me go back to what I was originally commenting on, and you can have the last word and I'll turn it over to others. But going back to the Luke issue, I guess, I mean, you presented it as kind of a problem that that Luke was using Mark, and at the same time that Luke said, lots of people were writing on this stuff. And I guess in my mind, if this was a real historical thing and Luke really was, trying to be a responsible historian, what would we see? Would it be that surprising that he would use Mark as a source, especially if he thought that Mark was, connected to eyewitnesses himself, and that he would, be honest about there being other reports that need to be assembled together? It sounds, when I read Luke 1, it's very much like a careful historian, and he isn't pretending to be an eyewitness himself. So in my mind, that just gives that really strong sense of, hey, this isn't just like someone faking it all. So that's all. You can have the last word.
And is it Chris?
I'm Blake.
Blake, I appreciate you making all those points. The one thing I just want to say about Luke is that's exactly what he wanted you to do. So he did his work well. He said, I'm a good historian. This is my job as a historian. And then nothing else in that book reflects any kind of historical methodology or even desire to reflect history. And so, Tim, when you and I were talking, one of the things I want to talk about the time frame and the difference between the synoptics and John, the cleansing of the temple, that's such a blatant violation of the chronology. In the synoptics, that happens at the end of Jesus' career, and that's what gets him arrested. In John starts his 3-year career by doing that. He's not even trying to match up to the synoptic gospels.
So why do you think they're the same event?
Do you really seriously think that an event so absurdly ridiculous, for starters, could happen once and not be noticed, but you're saying it could happen twice and it's like, oh, here it goes again, and no one would notice it? That's foolish to me. That's ridiculous to me.
The thing that brought me out from the other room was the claim you just made about basically denigrating Luke as something of a hack historian.
Hey, John.
Oh, Tim's got a
Oh
question.
yeah.
Could I respond to what David just said before you go back to the Luke issue?
Sure. That's fine.
Cool. So, David, 2 things. You said it's a ridiculous event. I don't see it as a ridiculous event at all. Number 2, you said, and not be noticed. I think it was noticed both times. That's why we've got accounts of both times.
Well, you know what? Every time the Gospels have something where someone says it happens one thing, and you do this double. Christians do this. Oh, it happened twice. It's like, no, it didn't happen twice. One says Judas hung himself, and the other one says Judas fell in a field and his guts burst out. There wasn't a cliff. There wasn't hanging. There wasn't 2 temple cleansings.
Wait, you're saying the Valley of Hinnom doesn't exist, and there are no olive trees along the edge of it?
Oh, please.
No, wait.
Please.
When you say there wasn't a valley, David, chill.
If we only had one of these Gospels, no one would ever be making such ridiculous claims.
That's the way it is.
And the more
history,
David, everything,
breathe. That's the way that it is.
Again,
that's the way that it is with history in all kinds of cases in secular history where we have multiple accounts, and you can say of any of them, well, if we had only Suetonius to read, then we would never have thought that. Yeah, that's right. And then we read Tacitus and we put the 2 of them together and we come up with a well-rounded picture of it. And yes, sometimes that means that we have to put together some things and say, wonder how this fits together. Sometimes we can do that more plausibly, sometimes less.
Thank you. Sometimes it's more plausible and sometimes it's less. And in
sometimes,
the Bible, and again, it's so less plausible.
Well, I think that you need an argument to back up that assertion.
Well, I've already put the argument out that John says this happened in the beginning of Jesus' career and launched it, whereas the other 3 Gospels say that this ended his career and was directly the cause of his death.
Right, and so we've got 2 different accounts, and the question is, why shouldn't we? No, we do have 2 different accounts. The question is, why should we not take, for example, the explicit chronological indicators in John's Gospel to give...
If you want to talk about explicit chronological indicators, do me a favor, Tim. Tell me what happened in the last 2 weeks of Jesus' life, according to John and according to the synoptics. What they did before they came to Jerusalem and what they did the morning of. Because I would like to see that.
I don't have to. It's already been done.
It has been done. I've done it. And it makes no sense whatsoever.
I suggest to you that you pick up John Wenham's book, The Easter Enigma, and have a look at it.
Well, right back at you, Tim.
Okay, I'm sorry. Which book would you like me to read? I've read yours.
My next book. I would like you to read that as well.
Tell me when it's coming out. Do you have an ETA on that?
Will do. Hopefully this year. Year.
I'll keep an eye out for it.
And this always happens. I apologize. I'm getting riled up. It feels like I'm taking crazy pills.
It's all good.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
It's all good.
It's all good.
Is John still there, or is he?
Blake,
I think we lost John.
I got work to do.
Okay, he just
Come back, John. Come back.
I was going to mention Colin Himmer's book on Acts.
I can't hear a thing he's saying. Blake, where are you? Where are you, Blake?
I was going to mention Colin
John.
Himmer's book on Acts. Quite possible you don't grant that Luke is the author of both the gospel and
no, I think he probably was.
Colin Himmer's book on Acts grants 80 to 90 some apparently first century attestations there that folks apart from the first century were not likely to have known, including things like the depth of the water in certain bodies of water where, for example,
the pool of Siloam, is that what you're talking about?
What's that?
The pool of Siloam, is that what you're talking about? Or
no, where Paul shipwrecked.
The temple or something?
Where Paul shipwrecked. That area was notorious for that, apparently. And that's something you would have known in the first century, but by the second century, it wouldn't have been knowable because that area wasn't dockable or wasn't used that way. But there's like 80 to 90 claims that Luke made that Colin Himmer vindicated, saying he was a first-class historian. Now, since he's doing the groundwork, since he's actually going and doing a lot of the meticulous stuff of just focusing on one book, I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt on this because, and this is my bigger claim, it seems that there's three ways we can approach, say, an untested text. Three ways we can approach it. One is we treat it as true until proven false, provisionally.
No historian does that.
I'm listing three logical options. I'm trying to cover all possibilities. False until proven true, or agnosticism. We just have no clue. We can't apportion any probability one way or another.
I'm going to give you a fourth option, and that's we can provisionally accept things according to the weight we get of the arguments supporting them, according to the amount of evidence supporting them.
That would be number one.
For instance,
true until proven false.
Go ahead. Say again.
You treat it provisionally as true until proven false. You don't have to.
No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying we can read everything that somebody said, and whether it's true or false, whether it's all true or all false, or there's just piece by piece, every claim that it makes in there, we need to be provisionally okay. Maybe this is true. How much support do we have for it? Maybe it's false. There's no document out there that everyone accepts as 100% true in the ancient world.
Granted. But I think we would have a non-starter if we assume, let's say a claim in one book, if we assume that it's false until proven true, anomalies could never be believed. Single event and single testification or testimony, we could never grant that. So history, we'd have to wipe it clean of anything that happened only once or only had one witness.
I agree. And for historians who say that rules out miracles, I'm not comfortable with that.
I didn't say miracles.
I try not to do that. Well, that's what I'm saying. Anomalies, as you say, we need to at least recognize that they're anomalies and try to construct plausibly why that is the case. Like Tim was saying, well, maybe there was 2 cleansing temples. Well, the first one didn't make any damn sense. How could there be 2? And how can we have historians who talk about Judea in the first century and not notice 1 and certainly not notice 2?
And your reference to a lot of the things that are not known, I think what Tim was getting at originally about the argument from silence is that if we treat something that's unstated as if it is a claim about something that we would otherwise want a statement for, then we might be saying it's false until proven true, or we're bringing in assumptions that aren't that are biasing our interpretation of a text.
Here's what I'm saying. I'm not making an argument of silence just because something doesn't appear in one gospel or another. What I'm saying is when one gospel has different motivations and different cause and effects and different chain of events and causality for the same event, one of them is not true. Maybe both of them are not true.
If
can't both be right. And trying to harmonize, Christians are notorious for trying to harmonize all these differing things, and they've been doing it for hundreds of years.
Logically speaking, the only way that one can exclude the other is if the claims that they're making are pure disjuncts.
Well, that's not true.
No.
If they're not true, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter many times Joseph Smith says the angel Moroni came to me, if the claim's not true at all, then we don't have to worry about any logical inconsistency. That's not the all be all.
You made a claim, and I don't think you're understanding the explanation. I think you're responding to something I don't think I was trying to say.
Keep going.
Logically speaking, if you're going to say that X, because of X, therefore not Y, you need to show that Y is necessarily impossible given X. And you said, and I'll give a real world example.
Sure.
So if I have a red car, does that disprove the claim that I have a blue car? Well, no, because I could have a red car and a blue car.
Sure.
If I have a red car, the necessary disjunct is that I do not have a red car. It is false to deny that. And so historically, when we've got, say, 4 witnesses and they're testifying to different things and some things seem to not fit quite right, but they're not strong disjuncts, then it's going too far.
They're not strong disjuncts. That's a subjective thing you're saying as well. Because, again, when we're talking about the Gospels and we're talking about the contradictions in the Gospels, you can spin encyclopedias listing the nitpicky little things that may just be some kind of minor glitch. I'm not talking about those. I'm talking about the major incompatibilities.
You mentioned Judas, and that's why I thought you were using things that might be reconcilable as proof against each other. When if a guy's hung, and from the hung spot he were to fall and be disemboweled on the ground, that's not a strict disjunct. You'd have to say, if one said he was hung and the other said he was never hung, then you have a strict disjunct.
Yeah, but history doesn't work like that. People don't write things like that. When they're telling 2 different stories, they're not worried about what this guy over here is writing. John certainly didn't worry about
that. They're not strict disjuncts in the text, but that's something you're bringing into it as a historical observer.
Let me tweet this. The field of blood that Judas bought, why was it named that? We have 2 different, completely incompatible reasons why it was called that.
Okay, completely incompatible. So what are the 2 reasons, and should I grant that they're strict disjuncts or compatible disjuncts? Because it could be that they're both. I could say male or female, but you could have a hermaphrodite. They're rare.
And again, every time Christians, and again, let me just say, you may be right. And it may just be that every single time we have this in the gospel, and we have them hundreds of times, that it just happens to be this kind of disjunct problem. That doesn't ring a bell with me. That doesn't hold water with me.
The reason I emphasize
at the end of the day, I'm not saying you're wrong for that. I'm saying that does not work for me at all. And I don't think you can people outside of this bubble of that.
The reason I emphasize this is when, say, a police officer comes across a crime scene and there's 4 witnesses. Because of the nature of human observation, we tend to focus on different details. And our memory is oftentimes imprecise. And oftentimes there are parts that are disproven within the testimony, but there's still parts that are vindicated overall because of what the police officer can grant from his own observations and from the facts of the matter and so on.
And my friend Jay Wallace makes that exact same
way that
analogy.
History is reconstructed. And this is the normal way that we try to verify historical claims. I kind of assume that you've got a disjunct problem. Are they strict disjuncts or just potentially contradictory? Or are they potentially contradictory, or are they compatible?
And
that's one way to reconstruct
this. One thing, we're not talking about just 4 eyewitness disjuncts. We're not talking about that. What we're talking about is literary creations that build on each other, ramify from each other, that take the basic writings of one and take it in other directions. And since there's multiple people writing, they're taking it in incompatible directions. And we see that again and again.
That's where it got interesting.
It's not, do I have a red car or a blue car? It's, did I drive my car to Dallas and do this over here? Or did I drive my red car and drive it to Amarillo, Texas?
Yeah, and if those are on different dates, then we have a compatible account.
We're talking about different dates, different actions, different motivations, different timelines. And we're talking about that through all the Gospels. Not just once or twice, not just here, but throughout the Gospels. Throughout the Gospel, we can see where they're building on the same thing, and when they're not in lockstep, verbatim, using the exact same wording, they're taking in their own directions and going.
So with the example of Judas,
they're repeating the same mistakes, and they're repeating the intercalation of it, where Mark, for instance, will separate a scene arbitrarily. It's nothing wrong with it. It's just a stylistic choice. But the guys who are copying him are following that same wording, so we know they're copying from him as well. That
Okay.
circulation
And
folds over.
I don't see how the fact of literary interdependence means that there's factual errancy there.
But wait, when you have interdependence and you have conflicting facts, what does that mean? What does that mean?
Conflict or just different conflict? Now, let me back up and try
Wait,
to
no,
get.
I didn't hear your answer. I didn't hear your answer. I'm sorry.
I repeated a prior point. It's not terribly important. Looking at Judas, for example, how he died. There's two accounts, and you mentioned.
Well, there's more than two actually. Those are just the ones that made it into the
four
Gospels.
accounts then.
There's also Papias. No, I'm not talking about the Gospels. I mean, we have completely other conflicting Christian accounts of how he died.
Okay, so I don't know about the non-gospel accounts of it.
Well, this is my point. Why do you accept the non-gospel?
Can I finish my point? I've got an illustration to make, and I need to develop to it. Okay.
Fair enough.
If one gospel account claims that Judas died by hanging himself on a tree, and another says he fell and was disemboweled, that's the example you mentioned.
In a field,
I'm bringing it back up, right?
Not off a cliff, but in a field. That he pitched forward and his bowels burst open.
Okay. Now you use that as an example of a strict contradiction. What I'm terming strict disjuncts. How are those strictly contradictory? And if there's another account you want to bring in from Papias, let's hear it.
Well, here's the thing. You could take the whole everything that happens with Judas, and first of all, from the beginning, from his betrayal to his death, there's not just incompatibilities. There's not just things that have to be harmonized.
One example of this account. I want to stay focused here because when we expand, you're going to go into all more claims than we can address.
And there's reasons for that. There's reasons that because you can say, oh no, we can make this fit. We can harmonize this. I'm sure you can find it, but you have to do this constantly in the Gospels.
That's how history works, as I understand it, especially when you've got multiple witnesses, because rarely are witnesses identical prior to the age of Xerox.
And again, these guys are not historians, and they don't claim to be,
right.
And they're not using historical methodology.
Can I just jump in?
I'm trying to get you to point out why I should understand even one example, and I'm trying to get specific with one example, so it's not just interpretation versus interpretation at some meta level. With Judas, why should I understand him falling down, being pitched to the ground, and his gut spilling out? Why should I understand that as a strictly contradictory thing compared to his hanging? And if it's not strictly contradictory, then the very example you gave doesn't illustrate the larger point you're trying to make. I don't know.
We could play the same game. We could play the same game with what happened at the tomb. We could play the same game of where he was born.
That they're not strictly contradictory.
We could play this game throughout the Bible.
Do you grant that they're not strictly contradictory? I'm keeping my focus small here. I just want one example. I haven't found one example from you. I've found punting to the abstract and how this is a big thing that bothers you. And okay.
Let's go back a little bit.
One example of a strict contradiction.
Let's go back a little bit. All right. Avoiding the whole theory of why would somebody just write half the story and say he hung himself? Oh, and then the rope snapped and then he fell. Or why would these guys say
there's no complete story that humans
without saying that he hung himself and fell off a cliff? Anyway, avoiding that whole issue altogether. Why do we have to play these harmonizing games in the first place? Okay, all right.
As I understand it, this is the nature of
just one example, and I told you already the cleansing of the temple. You say, well, Tim says, oh, well, it happened twice, and that explains it. Woo, no problem there. But you're making up a meta gospel to do that. You have to, you're not taking the gospel.
This is how I would approach any claim about history. If someone says Plato was in one city and another says Plato was in a different city, I would be interested to see, are they making claims about the exact same date? And if they're not making claims about the same date, was he known to travel? I want to see, can they be harmonized? If they can't, then whichever one seems to be most reliable, I'll give that one the benefit of the doubt, and I'll start to raise questions about the other one.
And that's good thinking. That's good thinking. But let me ask you this. What if you're reading something about Plato and it's saying something ridiculous like, and he went to Ireland and drove out the snakes? What if you read something about Plato and it says, oh, and he spoke fluent Spanish, when you have things that don't make sense in the historical context, like Jesus' trial, like Judas's betrayal of him, like the fact they needed.
Can you cite an example that's a parallel to the one you talked about? Like,
yeah. Okay. Let's say why things that don't make sense in the Gospels don't make sense.
A Middle Eastern man wandering around the Middle East doing things consistent with the Messiah seems. I mean, it could be false. It could be false.
Okay.
But I don't see how that's parallel to someone basically teleporting into a different country that they might not have even known about much.
Well, there is teleportation in the Gospels. Is that a weird thing?
I consider it weird. I do, and I don't.
Do you consider it weird that God created Gospels?
I'm looking for
created Gospels to
example
tell people the story, and they can't keep the story straight?
I'm sorry, I missed the last part.
Do you think it's weird? I mean, Tim made the point that, well, you know, there's minor mistakes, there's grammar, it's a human construction, is inspired by God. I'm putting words in your mouth there. But do you really think that God could inspire this and then not get it straight, not get it right?
I'm not interested in sophisticated bibliology.
That's not sophisticated. That's saying
no. We're doing history studies. You're jumping into theology.
You're just talking about teleporting Jesus, and that didn't give any problem at all.
I understand your expertise to be that of a historian, and I'm out of my expertise right here by trying to delve into this. Granted, but if you want to go into theology, biblical theology,
and we don't have to. We can stick on history, but just from history alone, things like Jesus' trial make no sense.
So
at all.
Okay, so
things like
with the Judas example, are you granting that those could be harmonized, but we should not harmonize them as historians unless we have some overwhelming evidence or some overwhelmingly compelling reason to give it that second effort to try to see if they harmonize?
What I'm saying is, if we have compelling reasons that these might be wrong or mistaken, that's a compelling reason.
Okay, yeah, if we did have compelling reason, yeah.
And we do.
Okay, I grant that you think you do, and I think we don't. Yeah. But I don't know that you've shown that the Judas example constitutes a strict contradiction, and so far you haven't offered a strict
Which is why I don't want to be here to drag you. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them think. You know, I can't make you see it the way I do. I can.
No. I see it the way you do. I just don't find it more reasonable than the position I'm taking.
I have a problem with the fact that a man rose from the dead and nobody noticed. I have a problem with that myself.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
let me ask you this. We're talking about Bible inerrancy earlier with Tim. Do you think the Bible is inerrant?
Do I think the Bible is inerrant? It's irrelevant to this, but I do.
Tell me about the verse.
But what I said so far could be applied to, Aristotle's works or something like that.
Well, except Aristotle doesn't say things like, for instance, that the dead saints in Jerusalem came out of their graves and wandered through Jerusalem. Aristotle never says anything like that. Matthew says something like that.
Aristotle says things about the four humors, which are antiquated pseudoscience. And he claims them to be factual. He treats them as sort of common sense.
And why don't we believe him?
We have external evidence surrounding it, but
thank you. Do we have external evidence
as a historical claim?
What?
When he's making historical claims, even if say Plato might refer to the gods or Aristotle refers to the gods, I don't treat his historicity, the claims about history, to be I don't treat those as false until proven true. I'm at least agnostic on it, and I tend to think that the best way to go about history is to treat it as true until proven false. And you're suggesting that the proof
it's not true until proven false. It's provisionally true, depending on how much evidence we have to support it.
Okay, yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah.
But when we have evidence that
for the time being, provisionally, yeah.
Okay, but let's get back to the zombie apocalypse in ancient Judea. I mean, what
is that attested in others? I'm looking for a strict contradiction because it seems that contradicts your metaphysical.
I'm not talking about contradictions now.
But
we can play the harmony game all day. Now I'm talking about what do you believe the things that are in the Bible? And the one I like to bring up is, do you think the
Well,
saints
it's just off
came
topic.
out of their graves and wandered to everyone in Jerusalem and no one noticed it?
Well, it's just off topic because I don't see a contradiction there because he's the only one.
I'm not talking about contradictions. I'm saying
I'm
is
trying
it
to talk about
possible?
contradictions. That was the nature of my question because
Right.
my core issue was you made a claim about harmonization that seemed inconsistent with the normal process of history. Now, I could probably talk about your views of aliens, but it's not really on topic, unless maybe you're saying aliens inspired this gospel or something, then it might come in. But even then, that's more of a metaphysical out there something. I'm trying to compartmentalize.
Well, you're acting as if
so that I'm
contradictions are the only problems with the
not letting it
gospel.
bias my interpretation. I'm sorry?
You're acting as though contradictions are the only problem I have with the Gospels. And what I'm trying to tell you is, no, there are bigger problems than that.
Oh, I know you have all kinds of problems, but I'm just trying to find one example of a strict contradiction to justify this commitment you have about the historiographical process.
I'll tell you the same thing I told Tim.
Contradiction to justify this assumption that
Okay.
two things that
I'll
are
tell you the
different
same-
should be treated
I'll tell you the
as
same thing I told
contradictory
Tim.
unless proven otherwise.
I'll tell you the same thing I told Tim. Look at what the Gospels say about the last 2 weeks of Jesus' life and about what happened after his execution and his resurrection.
Okay,
Compare all
I'll do
those.
that. I've been hogging the screen too much, but thank you for your time, David.
Okay, but wait, before you go, I just want to pin you down just a little bit longer in the hot seat.
Okay.
If you're talking about contradictions,
Mhm.
there are contradictions, and I say they're irrefutable contradictions because they are so detailed and so definite. And that is the last weeks of Jesus' life.
Yeah.
What I was going to tell you, though, is it's not just contradictions that are a problem. It's
Oh,
things
yeah, I
that,
know that. I just
that
wanted
contradict
to
history, that contradict what we know, and that even if they were abnormalities, even if they were a miracle and unrepeatable, I'm fine with that. But the fact that they would happen and no one noticed them outside of this feuding little cultlet that was a minor cult for 300s of years, that I have a big problem with, especially because we have information about much more boring things that were happening in Judea at the time. And yet they missed that. They missed this guy rising from the dead. They missed him coming back from the dead and spinning around as 40 days, by some accounts, 8 days, 1 day. They don't agree on that. And then ascending up into heaven. These are big ticket items. These aren't small items. These are big things.
Yeah.
And no one notices them.
Yeah,
Yet they
I'm
notice
just
much more boring things about
I was just trying to find one example of a strict contradiction. That's all I wanted to find because I know I'm not a historian. I don't want to go into all of the big messy.
all
I
I'm
know it's
saying.
messy work.
I take your. All I'm saying is Christianity is wrong, and you're wasting your life to follow it. That's all I'm saying. That's all
I
I'm
want
saying.
to pass it off to someone else because I feel like I've hogged the mic too long.
Good talking to you.
Thanks, John. I do want to come to Chris because he's been wanting to ask a question for a while. Let me unmute Chris. Chris, are you there?
I'm here.
Great. Well, do you want to make your question?
Sure.
Hey, Chris. Chris, before you ask your question,
Yeah.
where are you, Chris?
Chris, you want to turn on your video? There you go.
I can neither hear nor see Chris.
Can you see me now?
Yeah, we can say you're a little faint. Can you try to hold your microphone a bit closer?
I'll try.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
I can barely hear you, like a cricket.
How about now?
We may need some translation services.
Oh dear.
Sure.
Before you even ask your question, I just want to say, let me just take a breath. We're all friends here. We don't have to agree on this stuff.
Right. Yeah, we're just trying to understand your perspective. That's all.
Exactly. And I need to keep that in mind and not try to convince you all to become atheists right out of the gate.
Go ahead, Chris.
I've got the computer.
Oh, you're really quiet. Do you have another microphone at all?
I do not.
Maybe write down the question and
If David can't hear you, I will translate because I can hear you.
okay.
All right. Jonathan, I'll speak to you and then you can tell him what I'm saying. All right. I have 2 points based on what you guys have been saying so far, and then I'll ask my question after I just make the point. There's no point in going through each of the comments because we've basically been beating it like a dead horse. But this is just for background knowledge. All right, so the background points are 2. The first is about the gospel writers not identifying sources, and therefore they are not good historians. I think it's important to bear in mind that, in general, ancient Greek historians did not identify their sources either. W. Walbank, for example, notes the Greek historians typically did not identify their sources. And this is in Polybius, The Rise of the Roman Empire, published in 1979 by Penguin Books. And M.I. Finley says that, unlike Herodotus, Thucydides never names his informants, and on only 2 occasions does he say that he was a direct participant. And finally, Josephus, although he's not a Greek historian, he's a Jewish historian, but when he writes the Jewish War, he doesn't cite his sources there either. So I wouldn't toss out the Gospels as reliable sources simply because they don't cite their own sources of information. And then my second point of observation regards contradictions.
Do you want to get David on that first? And then
if he's got multiple questions, can we do one at a time? Because I'm barely hearing what he's saying at all. Something about gospel historians.
So basically, if I'll just quickly clarify his point, if you can hear him. Basically, he was saying that one of your objections to the Gospels was that they don't cite their sources. But this was he's arguing this is a common convention in ancient literature, and including Josephus don't always cite their sources.
Okay. First of all, I would disagree with that. I mean, yes, there were bad historians in the ancient world who didn't cite their sources. There were several of them, but even then they were recognized as bad historians, and we have historians talking about that. And Josephus actually does cite his sources. He talks about Nicholas of Damascus and Justus of Tiberias. And I believe he also mentions other sources as well. But even when that aside, there's not just a lack of sources that's the problem. It's when they're saying things that flatly contradict what we know about ancient Judaism, what we know about Judea and Galilee and geography, what we know about the way the Roman Empire was ran, the way we know how Judaism was practiced. All these things are problems, not just the lack of sources or the lack of cited sources. Period.
Okay, so what I'm saying.
Just try and raise your voice, Chris, so that we can all hear you.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah, just try and shout into the microphone.
All right. Okay. Well, what I'm saying is, W. Walbank, he doesn't say that only the bad Greek historians didn't cite their sources. He's saying this is just a general practice. They did not cite their sources in general.
Yeah, I don't think that's true. I think that's incorrect.
I know that. Well, you can read about it in his book about Polybius. But anyway, Josephus, I'm not saying that he never cites his sources. I'm saying in his work, The Jewish War, he does not cite sources. In his Antiquities of the Jews, he does.
Okay.
So that's just one of my points.
Okay. And again, that the citation is just one of my points as well. But
all right, fair enough. And then the second point, and I'll finally get to my question, I promise, regards the contradictions issue. And I'll just go to Josephus again. If you compare his autobiography to, again, the Jewish War, we discover there are actually contradictions not only on the basic plots of events, but the order in which they occur. And Shia Cohen, in fact, he has written a book called Josephus in Galilee and Rome. And he has extensive charts, just in tables actually, going through and saying, here's an example of contradiction, here's an example of a contradiction. And yet, even with all those contradictions peppered throughout the writings of Josephus, he is one of our best sources of information about the Second Temple period in Palestine. And so, again, I realize that's not your only objection to the Gospels, but I'm just saying we need, as historians, we need to be objective by looking at the big picture and make sure we're using the same criteria for judging sources across the board, as opposed to just saying, well, we'll focus on the Gospels while ignoring other writings from the same time period.
If I'm hearing you correctly, Chris,
Yeah.
I agree with every single thing you just said.
Wonderful. So finally, my question.
Yes.
I'm curious about how you interpret passages in Paul's letters that appear to indicate that Jesus was a human being.
Gotcha.
And specifically, I'm just thinking of 3 cases. One is Galatians 4:4, where it talks about when the fullness of time had come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under law. The second one is Romans chapter 9, verse 5. I guess technically I need to put Romans chapter 9, verses 3 to 5, because the context matters here. Paul says, my kindred according to the flesh, they are the Israelites, and to them belong the adoption, the glory, the covenants, the giving of the law, the worship, and the promises. To them belong the patriarchs, and from them, according to the flesh, comes the Christ. And then finally, in Romans chapter 1, verse 3, Paul says that Jesus came from the seed of David according to the flesh.
Right.
And so I think I'd be interested in hearing how you interpret these cumulatively.
Great. Those are great questions, if I'm understanding you right. Every time that Paul talks about things like the flesh of Jesus, he does it, well, he doesn't talk about, for instance, the disciples. He doesn't even use the word disciple. He doesn't talk about Jesus' time on earth. He doesn't talk about Jesus' ministry. He doesn't talk about Judas. He doesn't talk about Mary and Joseph. Everything he talks about Jesus, we see echoed in the book of Hebrews, where it talks about a heavenly high priest who sacrifices his blood and was of the flesh of David, was of the seed of David, if you will. And yet he's talking about a figure who's never even been on earth, who is doing all this in the heavenly sacrifice. And he even compares what he's doing in heaven with what's happening on earth, and say, now, if he was a priest, if he was on earth now, we wouldn't need him because we have high priests, you know. It's all very theological. It's all metaphorical. And it's talking about a mythological Christ, a celestial Christ, if you will. And I break this down a lot more in the book, in the next book.
Yeah, I'm aware that Earl Doherty and Carey are following him. They make that argument for Paul's belief in a celestial Christ.
Keep talking louder, Chris. I can't hear you anymore.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the celestial Christ.
Okay, that's
Paul.
where I'm coming from.
Yeah. I'm wondering, though, what you make of the specific examples that I've talked about. And also, Hebrews might have been written by Paul, but we're not sure.
I'm sure it wasn't. I
probably wouldn't use it as something reflecting Paul's thought. I would probably prefer to stick with his letters, but I was just curious what you think about those passages in particular. Well,
again, especially when you're talking about the seed of David, the fact that the Messiah had to be Jew would account for the fact that whoever was born had to be of the seed of David. It doesn't say, and he was born in Bethlehem a few years ago and lived in Nazareth and had a ministry. We never hear anything like that from Paul. Everything we hear from him says, oh, well, the risen Christ appeared to these guys according to the scriptures. He died and was crucified and rose again according to the scriptures. Everything he says about that is prefaced with that formula of, and we know this because it says so in the Old Testament. Not because I met these guys, not because I know these guys. The guy he says is the brother of the Lord, he never says it's Jesus' brother. And in the next chapter, he's asking, like, who are these guys? They're nobody to me. I don't know who they are. They're not even real Christians. They bring in false Christians, you know, and he's opposing them. It's like, he doesn't even have any time to defend himself saying, oh, no, I know this is Jesus' brother, but blah, blah, blah. He never says anything remotely like that. For him, they're all on the same playing field. For him and for all the other Christian writers before the Gospels, apostles doesn't mean anything except someone who's had a vision of Christ or who's found it in the scriptures.
Okay, so regarding the seed of David, you say that because the Jews at the time believed the Messiah had to come from the seed of David, they would say
Right.
that Paul would say that, well, I agree completely. I think that he was a Jew. But that would be something a historicist would say, not a mythicist. And then I'm also interested in what you make of the phrase born of woman in Galatians 4:4 and in Romans 9, where Paul says that the Christ came from the Israelites according to the flesh.
You know what's funny about that is he doesn't actually use the word that means born. He used the word that means made. So it's even more ambiguous than that.
Actually, the Greek word he uses there, it can also mean born.
It can also mean born, but it's not the
Yeah.
one that he ever uses as born in his writings.
True enough.
And I talk about that a great deal in the new book.
Yeah, so does Richard Carrier. However, we need to interpret Paul's writings within their Jewish context as well.
Well, we
And-
need to interpret Paul's writing in Paul's context.
Absolutely.
Where he's going away from. Well, actually, we don't have to go away from the Jewish context because we do have Jewish context for all these things, including things like the book of Hebrews, including what they were taking from Isaiah 53 and Zechariah and pretty much anywhere in the Hebrew scriptures. And books like First Enoch that aren't part of our Bible, but were part of Jewish scriptures.
Right.
And the Ascension of Isaiah. The Ascension of Isaiah is that gospel in a nutshell.
Actually, the Ascension of Isaiah actually does say Jesus came to the earth and he dwelt with men and he became like a human in form. And
That's the later recensions of it. But the earliest core of that has him going from heaven to heaven to heaven.
that's
And the
incorrect.
lowest descending. Go ahead.
That's actually incorrect. In the Slavonic version and basically the
Hold on. If you're quoting the Slavonic version of anything, you've got a serious problem because none of those date back to the original Greek.
If you've got, these are the earliest L2 and S2, I believe the exact numbers. I got to check that right here, just a second here.
Hey, Chris, let me stop you real fast before you go on that rabbit hunt. Because if you disagree with Carrier's assessment of these, you're going to disagree with mine.
Okay, I found it. Yeah, it's in Slavonic and L2, and these are the earliest recensions that Carrier gives. He says the Ascension of Isaiah, Slavonic and Latin 2, in these earliest versions, they don't portray Jesus as being anything more than a divine being. And my point is, if you look just at those recensions, the earliest ones, they do still portray him as being a human. But now, anyway, so I think we agree that in terms of Galatians 4 and born of a woman, that Greek word can mean born.
Oh, yeah, I say that as well. It's just not one that Paul favors to use in that context.
Yeah, and we need to remember that since Paul is a Jew, we need to think, okay, how did Jews at the time and before use that phrase? And when we look at the historical background of that, born of woman is simply an idiom used by Jews for saying that, yeah, somebody was a human being.
I'm not arguing with you on that score. They said Hercules was a human being. They said Perseus was a human being. These are all demigods. That's not taking away from the mythicist argument.
It's taking away from the Carrier/DeHardy thesis that they all occurred in a celestial realm, because I think Hercules was put on Earth, was he not, in human history?
You totally cut out. What did
Hercules was put on Earth, was he not, in human history?
Hercules was put on Earth? Was he not? Is that what you're saying?
That's
Yeah.
what he said, yeah.
Regardless of whether that's the case or not, the fact that he rose to the dead as the same way as the other savior gods did, we're talking in that same context. That these are figures who have celestial bodies, they have celestial blood, they could be buried in celestial earth the way Adam was in the ascension of Moses. The human being is a requirement of him having blood and flesh to sacrifice. He's not talking about him being on earth and having a life, and none of the features that we see from his life story show up in any Christian writings before Mark's gospel.
Okay, so my point is...
Well, I think what you're trying to say is because the verse says born of woman, that means he was born on earth to woman. Well, it says
my point is that phrase is a Jewish phrase, and it's just a way of saying he became a human being.
yeah, and I don't think I agree with that, is what I'm saying.
On what basis? What's your evidence?
Because what he's talking about is not somebody who's on earth, but a celestial being in a celestial environment.
Well, that's an assertion. That's the case you need to prove.
That's what my new book talks about. But again, it sounds like you've already read Carrier's arguments on this and aren't impressed with it. So you're not going to be impressed with what I have to say either, is what I'm saying.
Okay. Well, I was just curious to see what you thought about those verses. So thanks for entertaining me.
I live to serve.
Are you done, Chris, or have you got more?
I had more, but I'll let someone else talk a bit.
Okay, great. Mark
Thanks.
wanted to say something. Do you still want to say something, Mark?
Sure. Hi, David.
Hi, Mark.
I was an atheist in the 60s.
Don't change your mind.
We'll probably touch on that.
Okay.
Back in the 60s, we were all mythicists. I don't think that if anyone said that they believed that Jesus was an historic figure, that we would have agreed that they're truly an atheist. That's just the way it was back in the 60s. I was good friends with a lot of atheists, and we all talked about it, and we just all believed that Jesus was a myth, he was a legend, he was whatever, but he never existed. And as I listened to you, most of the arguments that I've heard you present, I read your book, are very familiar to the same arguments that I shared as an atheist. So the arguments aren't a whole lot different. I think it's because the same kinds of problems with the Gospels that were there 50 years ago are still there today. You know, the way people view the problems.
Sure.
So the thing that's been interesting to me, I became a Christian in 71. And the thing that's been interesting to me since that period of time is that there was a shift within atheism toward a scholarly belief in the historicity of Christ. That's just something I watched as I kept reading. I kept reading different atheist writers, and it seemed like from what I believed and what I shared with people in the 60s, by the 80s and 90s, atheism had shifted away from mythicism and more to, well, we believe that Jesus, sort of the Bart Ehrman thing. Jesus was an historic figure, but he wasn't God. So it's been interesting to me since, I guess, maybe 5 years ago. Who was it? Thompson?
Tom Thompson?
Thomas Thompson wrote a book about
the Old Testament patriarchs, or about the mythicist, the myth.
I'm trying to remember the name of the book, Jesus Messiah or something like that. And then I read, there was a book by Earl Doherty. There was a book by Richard Carrier. I read your book. Your book came out before Carrier's, I believe, from what I can remember.
The most recent one.
Yeah. So, yeah, the one that he wrote on the historicity of Jesus, why we might have reason to doubt. Was that it?
Right.
So anyway.
What was your impression of that book?
Well, I disagreed with a lot of it, a lot of different points. I would love to talk to Richard someday about some of those points. But you brought up some points I'd like to ask you about.
Okay.
Okay. You said something at the very beginning that I thought was right on, because that's where I was in 1971. You said what in the Gospels is real and what is myth? And that was a question that I had as well. I had to go through a process of saying, okay, could a God even exist? I didn't even deal with the Jesus thing.
Sure.
For me, the bigger issue as an atheist who believed Jesus was a legend was, could a God even exist? Once I worked through that process, then my next question was, well, could the God that exists be the God of the Bible? Is the Bible a credible historical document? So I went through that process. That eventually got me to the Gospels and to the Pauline epistles, And then I had to face, okay, I don't believe in the supernatural. I don't believe that Jesus was a real historical individual. So what historical proof is there? What evidence is there? And I was coming at it, I think, from probably the same place you are.
Sounds it.
It sounds, from what I've listened to you, it sounds like we were both pretty much in the same point. I went through a lot of the evidence that I've heard discussed, and I came to a different conclusion, which would be obvious because I became a Christian.
Yeah.
So there has to be a difference in how we see things. That's something that I found interesting, and I wanted to ask you about. You mentioned that there is a lack of consistency about the character of Jesus Christ in the Gospels.
Yeah.
Could you go into that a little bit more depth for me on that?
Sure. It feels like when I read Mark that you're getting a very low rent, no frills version, a very human, very fallible Christ that's very much in line with the idea of what the early Christians called adoptionist, where Mark presents a human being who only because he is favored by God at his baptism, and only because he's so obedient even unto death, that after his death he becomes exalted and becomes Jesus Christ the Savior. We see that in Mark. We even see a hint of that in the kenosis hymn in Philippians, where Jesus doesn't get the name Jesus until after he dies. That's a really strange thing to me. When you see what Mark and Luke in turn do to Matthew and Luke do to Mark's gospel, how they take that basic story. Luke repeats a lot of Mark's mistakes. Matthew corrects a lot of Mark's mistakes. And they again, when they're not in lockstep with Mark, they're expanding on it and taking it in completely different directions. Then you've got John, who comes later still, and he doesn't even try to match the synoptics. In ways as simple as, Matthew, for instance, is a very Jewish Jesus and corrects a lot of mistakes that Mark makes. Luke doesn't be as keyed into that because he makes a lot of the same mistakes Mark does about geography, for instance, and basic Judaism. And he seems to be more familiar with Rome because he talks about things in Rome like the three taverns and without any explanation for his audience. And again, John, it has a completely different, there's no parables from John. John takes things out of the Gospels that he doesn't like and just removes it. Things that would embarrass Matthew and Luke to make them alter it and change what Mark originally says. John just takes it all together as if it never happened. And he changes around the time frame of things that happen. And the reason Jesus dies is different for him as well. And those are just the four that made the cut, of course. We've got all the other later Christian writings, like the Gospel of Peter, that we still have chunks of, where the story is even getting bigger. And you see the evolution of the story grow from Mark to Matthew and Luke, and then to John, and then to Peter, and all the others that are floating around at the time. And to make matters worse, our text evidence for the New Testament, our repertory of texts that we have, surviving texts, is very scattered and very spotty up until the late 2nd century. It's not until the late 2nd century that we start to get complete books, more or less complete books of books. And it's not until the 4th century that we actually get a complete New Testament, 2 complete New Testaments, Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Vaticanus, and they aren't the same as each other. And neither of them is the same as ours. We have books they don't have. They have books we don't have. So, and I only bring all that up to say that that's what the books we have now are all scholarly reconstructions from texts that we don't have the originals of. We don't even have anything close to the original for at least the first 150 years, if not the first 250 years of Christianity. So we don't know what the originals actually said either. We just know that at every level of surviving texts, we can detect interpolations. We can detect changes for doctrinal reasons, dogmatic reasons. Again, not talking about grammar errors, not talking about spelling errors, but talking where this faction over here wants it to say something else than this faction over here. And those things are changing. And the fact that those Gospels were written at all, I mean, Matthew wasn't setting out to write Gospel number 2. He was just making corrections to the only Gospel he knew about. Same with Luke. And Luke implies that in his opening statement, that he's the only one that's really done the work and that nobody else has. And therefore, by implication, we should listen to what he has said and not to anybody else's.
Well, I don't get quite that sense with Luke, but when I took a look at the 4 Gospels,
yeah,
it seemed very obvious to me that they were written for different purposes.
Sure, I agree.
Matthew appeared from the very beginning, that appeared to be more Jewish.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Dealing with, does he have a lineage that goes back to King David?
Yeah.
Could he be the Messiah, kind of thing? And
of course, Luke does the same thing, but he uses a different genealogy altogether.
He uses Mary's genealogy, which takes him all the way, through.
Wait, no, stop. He doesn't use Mary's genealogy. Nowhere does it say that he's using Mary's genealogy.
You're right. Okay.
And to be honest, I've heard that excuse a lot, but it says his father Joseph.
It goes back through a different son.
Well, no, but he ends up at Joseph. So, and he, with a different number of generations as well. And yet somehow both of these completing genealogies also managed to include 2 of the famous figures from the New Temple period, the Babylonian period, that shouldn't be on the same genealogy if they're talking that these came from different sons and they're both meant to be genealogies of Joseph. They don't work as genealogies of Mary. For one thing, in the Jewish context, they didn't keep track of the women that way. And they didn't, it drives me a little crazy to hear excuses like that. And again, I'm not jumping on your case, but you just said that as if it were an established fact, and yet it's not. And it seems like biblical studies is rife with this thing where something is said as if it were a long settled established fact, and the opposite is true. It's not a fact. It's not even true. Sorry, rant over.
My only point was going to be that I saw that each one of the Gospels were written for apparently different audiences.
Sure.
They're written at different times. You talk about the synoptic. There are some similarities among Matthew, Mark, Luke. John is different. John seems to have a different audience, or at least he is not dealing with some of the same details of Christ's life.
Okay.
John brings in things that Matthew, Mark, Luke don't even bring in.
Yeah.
So as an atheist, when I'm looking at this, I'm saying, okay, am I seeing 4 different stories that tell me a story about 4 different types of people who don't look alike, they don't talk alike, they don't think alike? These are 4 different Jesus. But what I noticed as I looked through Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and just at the character, and I'm addressing that because you mentioned that, the character of Jesus, even though each gospel addresses some different aspect of his character doesn't change.
Oh, but I so disagree with that. I
know you do. I understand you do, David. I'm just sure.
Well, and I thought I made that really clear in the book, nailed already.
Correct. Yeah. You asked me how did I change?
Oh, gotcha.
I'm going back to your earlier question.
You're right.
So as I looked at the 4 Gospels, I said, okay,
Wait, back up a little bit. I totally lost you for a second there.
Okay. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. I was looking to see, all right, does one gospel writer say that Jesus didn't die on the cross?
Why would they say that? I don't know why you would expect that.
As an atheist, I was also a journalist. That was my career. So I was also looking from a journalistic perspective to see from these different writers, are they saying different things? Does one say he died on a cross, another says he died in a horse accident? Does one writer say he raised from the dead? 2 more say they found his body and dragged it through the streets. I was looking to see, out of 4 different writers, was there some difference as to the basic storyline? Being a journalist, I was used to interviewing people and hearing different things from different people about the same event. You know, I would go to a murder or a fire or whatever, and I would talk to as many people as I could find and talk to investigators, police investigators, and I'm looking for what are the things that are the same and what are the things that are different. Trying to find out, is somebody lying? Is somebody covering something up? And most of the time, I found that when someone didn't have skin in the game, they were just a witness, that they normally just told you what they saw, whether they understood the ramifications of what they saw or not. If somebody had skin in the game, they might say, okay, I'm not going to tell that information to an investigator because it would get my friend Bob in trouble. You know what I mean?
Uh-huh.
So if I was a witness, but I was also involved in some way, I might try to cover something up. So I was looking for those kinds of things. Then I looked at Luke, who wrote Acts. I looked at Paul. I kept looking for somewhere where there was a difference in the basic message of the life of Christ. He came, he preached, he died, he rose. It just seemed to be the same story. I found that interesting.
Let me ask you this. You keep using the word eyewitnesses. What about the accounts made you think these were written by eyewitnesses?
Well, not just written by eyewitnesses, but they were written about eyewitnesses. Now, Matthew,
what you're describing as hearsay is what I'm saying.
Not necessarily. As a journalist, I would report every day at 5 and 6 o'clock what I heard people say. Sometimes I would play a soundbite of what they said so people could see what they said. I was in television by then. But oftentimes I would say I talked to 15 witnesses and they told me that. I interviewed investigator A and he told me that he talked to other people I did not have access to, and he told them that. As a crime reporter, I followed the story from the crime all the way through the judicial system, so I was able to see the lawyers ask the tough questions in a court of law before a judge and a jury. So just looking at a whole time frame, the whole process of how you go through, you don't have to be an eyewitness to report something. Do you agree?
To a point.
Okay.
The problem I have is when these are being presented as if they were eyewitnesses, when they clearly are not. Clearly, and
okay.
when by the same, and well, for instance, they don't identify themselves as eyewitnesses. They're not written in the first person as eyewitnesses. All of them are literally dependent on the first one, the oldest one, and the story evolves from there. That's not eyewitness accounts. That's not crime scene accounts. This is literary borrowing.
Okay, I don't.
Word for word, they're going off in different directions.
I don't agree with that.
Well, but wait, I'm not. It's a fact. You can see it. You can look up synoptic problem and see the examples that they're using to put that forth. Look at the details and see where the stories don't hold together, because it's not enough to say that, well, they all agree that he was born, that he was crucified, and he died. That's the mythicist theory, is that was what he did. And how do they know that? Because it was according to the Jewish scriptures. They found this story in the Jewish scriptures and attributed it to Jesus. And everything we see from the Gospels is getting plucked and picked apart from the old Jewish scriptures and from non-Jewish scriptures even, or non-Jewish, non-scripture writings rather, to create the story that fulfills expectations of the Messiah retroactively.
David?
Or I could be wrong about all that, but that's how it seems to me.
Can I just interrupt for a second here?
Sure.
And then I'll back out. David,
No worries.
I think I heard you say that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons in your litany of reasons that you thought that these were not eyewitness reports is that they are not written in the first person. Did I mishear you?
For instance, if you're going to the wee passages of Acts is where I think you're going with that.
No, actually, that wasn't where I was going.
Okay. Well, for instance, Matthew, if it was written by Matthew, a disciple, never says anything to that effect, never gives any kind of accounts that we don't already hear from Mark, who's, even by that account, is not an eyewitness. You know what I'm saying?
But specifically, okay.
He didn't say, I met Jesus this day, this happened to me. It's
Right.
not told from anybody's perspective except the same generic perspective. And it's like Peter's role grows as the story, and everybody else becomes like a Greek.
Okay. I wanted to focus on one point.
Okay.
And that was your mentioning of they're not writing in the first person.
Well,
I realize you have other things, but I wanted to focus on that point.
Okay.
And this is, you said sometimes friendly critics can help you not to use arguments. I'd like to help you not to use that argument. Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars are written throughout in the third person. Xenophon's Anabasis is written throughout in the third person. Many of the passages of Josephus' Jewish war where he portrays himself as an actor in the circumstances, he refers to himself in the third person. The Civica of Dexippus is written in the third person. That's not something we would expect to be different if they were eyewitnesses talking about their own actions. I know Bart Ehrman has used that,
I agree with you.
so I would not use that as an argument. And
to be fair, I don't rest my case on that. That's just one of the many planks.
I would suggest that you throw that plank out and see what you can do with the rest of them. But I'm going to let Mark have it over back now.
Okay.
All right. Let me ask you another question, because I remember when I read your book, I think you said something about how apologists often use the term eyewitness when we're talking about people who lived in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries.
Sure.
Okay.
I had a problem with that.
Well, I don't know of any apologists who would use that term eyewitness.
Well, I do find that those names were constantly being thrown back at me by people who were using it fast and loose.
Okay.
So that's why I use those 17 names and not any,
Well, I guess I'm looking at the word eyewitness. When I think of an eyewitness, I think of somebody who witnessed something with their eyes. They saw it themselves.
Sure.
So I wasn't quite sure why you used people from the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century as if they were eyewitnesses of Christ when he was alive.
Well, no, I don't. That was my whole point, is that we should not count these as eyewitness. We shouldn't treat any of this as eyewitness, because all of this was written decades after the fact.
Well, I agree with you.
It's one of the reasons we know they weren't eyewitnesses.
I may be misremembering your book, but I thought you were saying that Christian apologists used the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century people to say they were eyewitnesses of the life of Christ.
Yes, and that is erroneous, as we know, and they should know that too. But nonetheless, those are the names.
I wouldn't say that.
I agree. I get it.
I wouldn't say that Teutoonius or Lucian or Eusebius were eyewitnesses of the life of Christ, because they lived way too late.
Right, and even though they're not eyewitnesses, those have been betrayed. Well, if they're not eyewitnesses, they're at least historical.
Well, there are people who wrote about things.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And I take that for.
I think I make that nuance a little clearer and nailed, actually.
Okay, because I would never use that argument. The only people I would say were eyewitnesses were people who actually saw Jesus.
Right.
And so when I look at the eyewitnesses, I'm looking at people like Peter and James and John and Matthew and Paul, because of the what he saw. Those people, if they say something, if they write something or say something or are quoted as saying something, I'm interested in what they say. Sure. Because they lived at the same time as Jesus.
Well, that's begging the question, but yes,
they say that they lived.
The author of these stories is saying they lived at that time.
Correct. So then you have to go and you have to look at Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Acts and say, okay, can we trust these writers? And
Right.
I sense from what you're saying is that you do not trust them as being honest.
Yes.
They're not writing honest.
Let me harsh out that a little bit more. It's not that I'm saying they were deliberately falsifying something to fool people, a la Joseph Smith, who was clearly doing that just to do that. These people were writing what I think was an allegory. Let me back up. I think Mark was writing an allegory, and Matthew and Luke followed in his footsteps. And by the time this story gathered momentum, it made more sense theologically to say, oh, this really happened, not this is an allegory. And if you read between the lines, you can see what we're really talking about.
It doesn't. It didn't appear to me to be allegorical.
Well, in my new book, I go point by point throughout the Gospel of Mark, and I'm showing what it's an allegory of, where it's getting it, where the word for word is coming from this source or that source. And maybe at the end of the day, I won't convince you of that either. But again, that's where I'm coming from.
No, I understand, and I appreciate that. I look forward to reading your next book because I always want to see. I keep an open mind. I've been a Christian 45 years, but I keep an open mind.
That's why I'm talking to you guys. That's why I'm talking to you.
I mean, just like Jesus, just like Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then our faith is in vain. Well, if he never lived, he couldn't have risen, right?
Yeah.
So this mythicism argument is very interesting. It disappeared for so long. It was interesting to me 10 years ago when I started hearing it or reading about it again. I know there are others who want to ask questions, so let me just ask one more.
Okay.
Because you and I, nobody on this call lived at the time of Christ, so the first century. So we're all dependent on finding the best writings, best evidence.
Best evidence is a good way to put it.
Yeah, looking for the very best evidence that we can look at and say, okay, in all good conscience, with all of my reasoning abilities, with all the logic I can come up with, I believe that's a good piece of evidence to trust. I mean, that's always the thing that we have to go to. Some of the, if I remember in your book, some of the people that you quoted as being people who lived in the first century who never wrote anything about Jesus. You mentioned several writers, I think.
Well, I kind of did a laundry list. I avoided what things like what scholars like Rembrandt do of just naming every single Roman who ever existed. I try to keep it to those who had a reason to mention Jesus. And to be honest with you, I don't even use that argument in the new book at all, because we don't have to rely on arguments of silence. Our argument from silence isn't a fallacy, but by the same token, we can see the evolution of early Christianity and the variations of early Christianity. We can already see that in Jewish writings and Philo's writings, in other in mystery faiths. What we know of them, we can see the same parallels in there. Not to the extent that Christianity is a copycat of the mystery faith. I don't think it was a copycat. I think it was a mystery faith, and that's why we see those similarities.
Okay.
I think it was a Jewish version of the mystery faiths.
All right. The reason I brought it up is because I remember reading that and thinking, and I think at the time I may even looked a little bit, researched it. I was looking to see how many copies of the writings that you were quoting from existed, and how far from the original writing would the copies have been. And I don't remember all of the numbers, but it seemed like there was very, very thin copy evidence for some of those people.
Well, there is, and that's part of the reason we have to weigh everything that we gauge by them. Was it Tim who made the point that, or Chris, who made the point about Josephus? It's like, yes, there are some serious problems with Josephus. There are serious problems with Eusebius, and yet they're our only source in so many cases. So we have to take everything some of these guys say with a grain of salt. Others have been vindicated through the way the evidence from other sources, corroborates what they say, the physical evidence, the brute force of history evidence.
Yeah, I wasn't talking about them. I was talking about the ones that you listed in your book that you said if Galileo, I think, was one.
Galileo?
I think there was one, Seneca the Younger.
Uh-huh.
And I think you had written something about these people wrote a lot, and if they knew anything about, if Jesus really existed and was the big deal that he was, they should have written something about it. My only question was, how many copies of their writings and how close to the original writings do we have the oldest copy? Similar to questions we might ask about biblical text.
Sure. Well, in the case of biblical text, I do talk about those numbers and why the multiplicity isn't as impressive as it should be, because most of the copies we have are 9th century or later. Whereas when it comes down to what we really need, root manuscripts, the original manuscripts that these traditions come from, and these literary trunks, if you will, come from, we have very few in Christianity.
Well, there's really a lot of, one of the things that impressed me was how many texts there were.
Well, again, read my chapter in Nailed on that again. It's very less impressive. Suddenly, the comparisons that people like Metzger and Strobel make to Homer and to the Iliad are much less impressive when you look at those numbers. And
then also the writings of the early church fathers, the end of the 1st century, early 2nd century, they quoted a great deal. You know what's funny about that is that's the chapter I'm working on right now at home. I'm working on Ignatius of Antioch, and same thing with Clement of Rome. It's very interesting to see the things they say about Jesus and the things they don't say about Jesus, and that's something that I don't think either side of the debate has been spending too much time on until very recently, and it's shocking to me what good cases for mythicism we get from these later Christian writers, like those guys in particular. I mean, Josephus, I feel like I've beaten that horse, to the ground, and yet there's still things I want to say about that in the new book. Well, you asked me earlier, why did I change?
Yeah.
Giving you sort of an idea.
Okay.
But I stay open. I've read your book. I've read Carrier's book, Robert Pierce. I think that's his name. Is that right, Robert?
Mm-hmm. Robert Price?
Price. I'm sorry, Robert Price. So I will continue to read and to look, but I have not found anything that has changed my mind from the decision I made 45 years ago.
Well, fair enough. Fair play. Well, I really enjoyed talking to you, and I look forward to more conversations with you as well. Good.
And I've got your email. I'll drop you a line sometime.
Tell me your name again.
Mark McGee.
Mark.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Great talking to you.
Yes, sir.
Jacob wanted to ask you what you think is the strongest and weakest argument in favor of the historical existence of Jesus.
The strongest, the single one. There's so much to unpack. The single strongest and weakest. I don't even know what I could say. I mean, in Nailed, I make the point about how Jesus does all these amazing things, and yet outside the Gospels, there's no corroboration for him for any of these things. And yet at the same time, when he dies, there's all these feuding little house cultlets scattered all over the empire. The distribution is one of the things that just baffles me, if anything in the Gospels is true. I would direct him to that chapter in Nailed, Can Jesus Be Saved? And he'll have a better idea how to answer that.
I did want to ask you, because you mentioned Ignatius, and I'm a big fan of Ignatius. He's probably my favorite church father.
Yeah.
I've read Ignatius's letters multiple times, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on this text from Ignatius where he says, I caution you in this way.
Tell me which letter it's from, first of all, because there's so many forged letters of Ignatius.
This one is from the Smyrnian epistle.
Gotcha.
Right. And obviously, he was very much a combatant against the Docetic Gnosticism. He was, of course, a companion of Polycarp, who was acquainted with John. At least that's what Irenaeus tells us.
That's what they tell us, yeah.
And Ignatius says, for my own part, I know and believe that he was an actual human flesh, even after his resurrection, when he appeared to Peter and his companions, he said to them, "Take hold of me, touch me, and see that I am no bodiless phantom." And they touched him then and there, and believed, for they had contact with the flesh and blood reality of him. That was how they came by their contempt for death, and proved themselves superior to it. Moreover, he ate and drank with them after he was risen, like any natural man, though even then he and the Father were spiritually one. And he says that. Just a little bit down from there, he says, "After all, if everything our Lord did was only illusion, then these chains of mine must be illusory too. Also, to what end have I given myself up to perish by fire or sword or savage beasts?" And so on. So he seems to be quite emphatic in the physicality of Christ's presence, no?
And it's even more than that, because he also goes on to say, don't listen to those other Christians who say that Jesus wasn't truly born, wasn't truly risen, didn't truly suffer. He makes it's very clear that he's, and the ironic thing actually about that letter is, talking about the chains illusionary, is that's probably a forged letter that he never wrote at all. There's good arguments to be made that all the Ignatian letters are written by the bishops who he's writing them to, ostensibly.
Well,
but he makes the point that he's very insistent to don't listen to those Christians who say that Jesus didn't really exist, basically, which is normally taken to being against Docetism. But the point I want to make is that even Docetism, as it's presented to us, isn't just necessarily the idea that Jesus was a phantom of some sort and only appeared to do these things, which is how it's always presented to us, and which I think may be a straw man used by those apologists. But I think he's talking about the Christians who are saying, no, this is just an allegory. In the same way that the letter of Peter, who says, oh, we didn't fall for cunningly designed fables. We really saw this with our eyes. And then he quotes the Old Testament for his eyewitness account. It's these forgeries that come later. The things that they say like that aren't very good witnesses to Jesus if they're real, because they don't talk. People don't talk about like that if they're talking about a real person. They talk about that if they're trying to convince people that he's a real person. Okay.
You mentioned that you think the Ignatian epistle to the Smyrnians was a forgery. Now,
there's scholars out there. This is widely debated, but there's scholars who don't think none of the epistles are real.
Right.
And many others that think, well, maybe the first one is real.
But it is the mainstream position that they are authentic, at least in the shorter forms of the Ignatian epistles.
I got to tell you, when anyone starts telling me about the consensus and the mainstream,
okay,
I want to know what's that based on. I don't want to hear that the majority of biblical scholars agree that that's the case.
Sure. But the only reason I mentioned that is because I'm not saying I'm going out on a limb and using the Ignatian epistles and assuming that to be Ignatian. But but Polycarp does mention, of course, Ignatius wrote to Polycarp, and Polycarp in his own epistle, we have one surviving epistle of Polycarp to the Philippian church. And
I hate to tell you what I think about Polycarp's epistle too, but keep going.
But Polycarp does make mention of the Ignatian epistles. But I'm just curious as to what your positive arguments are for rejecting out of hand all of the Ignatian and Polycarpian, presumably, epistles.
Well, honestly, like I was telling Mark, that's exactly what I'm working on right now. So bear with me until I finish this chapter. But, in general, you can say that once we get to the Church Fathers, I'm less and less impressed with the veracity of them. And of course, I'm not the only one.
Sure. Speaking of the early Church Fathers, I did want to make a comment pertaining to the early Church Fathers in relation to the authorship of the Gospels, because I know that you, along with most scholars as it happens, reject the traditional authorship of the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Right.
Now, you're aware, of course, that in the early 2nd century, until you get up to Papias in the 130s, all the Gospels and New Testament writings or at least the Gospels are quoted without names necessarily being attached to them, right?
Well, that's not exactly right, because some of the quotes that we get aren't from the Gospels. I'm thinking exactly of Clement of Rome. What his quotes from the Gospels are, most of them are quotes from the Old Testament, and the ones that are seemingly quoting Jesus are taking what's separate sayings in the Gospels. He's crammed them together into two, implying that these weren't originally about Jesus, or they weren't originally said by Jesus anyway.
Sure. I mean, there are some that are like that, but there are also lots of other cases where there are quotations from the Gospels.
Well, there's not lots of cases.
Okay, but when they are
quoted too, but go ahead.
I mean, the Old Testament is often quoted also without names being attached to them, and
sure. But often they're quoting the Old Testament and saying this is Jesus talking to us, saying this, and what we're getting as a quote is an Old Testament quote, and they do the same thing with the Holy Spirit as well.
Okay, but you can see that there are some. I need to pull up a list to get them all, but there are certainly quotations in the early part of the 2nd century attributed to the Gospels without names.
But he explicitly says that the Old Testament scriptures are the voice of the Holy Spirit. He explicitly says that. That's not even speculation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, Justin Martyr speaks about there being so-called memoirs of the apostles.
Right.
And he says in his first apology that they're also called gospels, right?
Yeah.
And
we know there were gospels floating around at that time.
Yeah.
We just don't get ours pinned down until way in the late of the 2nd century with Irenaeus of Lyons.
Yeah, well,
those are the only definite ones we can point to.
I mean, Papias, if you take Eusebius's quotation as Papias, then Papias tells us that Matthew and Mark wrote the Gospels. I mean, I know that Matthew he tells us in relation to Matthew that Matthew wrote in the Aramaic.
Exactly, and we know that's not true. And for some reason, there's like puns that only work in Aramaic, not Hebrew.
Right.
Or I'm sorry, in Greek, not Aramaic or Hebrew.
And he tells us that Mark wrote the gospel and that he based it upon the eyewitness testimony of Peter.
And yet it doesn't read like eyewitness testimony. It does. The other gospels have more stories about Peter. And again, I keep harping on this, but everything about the construction of that, from its literary structure to its ring structure to its vocabulary to its time frame, just about every vector you can have for a literary construction indicates it's an allegory, including the fact that in Mark 4:11 he has Jesus basically winking to the audience and saying that.
Have you read concerning the influence of Peter on Mark's gospel? You must have read Richard Baucham's book Jesus and the Eyewitnesses. Am I right? It's a classic. I mean,
yes.
Because he outlines some internal indicators for Petrine authorship, and I think there's also some very powerful external, not Petrine authorship, Petrine influence. And I think there's also some external indicators as well. I mean, just to give a few examples, Richard Bauckham points out the frequent mention of Peter in Mark's Gospel. He refers to Peter a total of 26 times, whereas Matthew mentions Peter only 3 additional times. And of course, Matthew is about double the length of Mark, and so you've got a lot more.
The information that we get from Matthew is more specific than what we get from Mark. For instance, the biggest thing that happens to Peter is when Jesus tells him that he's the rock that he's going to build his church on. That doesn't happen in Mark. That doesn't happen until the later Gospels. It's hard to believe that if it came from Peter, they would forget that one incident.
Sure. I mean, I think there's there's a cumulative case from there's several. I don't think I would use that as an argument against Petrine influence, but there are certain arguments which I think support Petrine influence. I mean, he also argues, for example, that Mark is the only gospel author who doesn't use Simon Peter when talking about Peter, but instead using either Simon or Peter, and Simon, of course, being a very common name in Palestine.
Sure.
But Mark doesn't have to distinguish him from the other Simons, and so it suggests familiarity. And also, Mark's gospel is bookended with the disciple Peter, and so he's the first and last disciple mentioned, which has been identified in other ancient texts as a phenomenon where a source is being attributed to a particular eyewitness. So the only point I want to make on that is that you have this convergence of internal and external corroboration for the Petrine influence on Mark. Moreover, it seems unlikely because we don't just hear this from Papias, we also hear this from Irenaeus of Lyon, and we also hear it from Clement of Alexandria. I think Tertullian says it as well, that Peter was an influence on Mark's gospel. And it seems unlikely that Mark would have been so unanimously the attributed author of the Gospel of Mark.
Well, wait, why do you say unanimously attributed? Because we don't get any attributions of any sort until the very late 2nd century with Irenaeus. Before that,
we have Papias is not like 2nd century.
But we don't even know that the Gospels he's talking about, the books he's talking about, are even our Gospels.
Well, actually, I would disagree with you about
Another one that were floating around at the time with those names.
I know Bart Ehrman makes this argument as well. I mean, let me just make an argument quickly for.
Are you still there? John, hold on. I completely glitched out for a second there.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Now I can.
Okay, great. Let me quickly give you an argument for why I think that at least the Gospel of Mark in Papias is the same that we have in our canonical Gospels.
Wait, now Papias is the one who says it was originally written in the Hebrew language?
That's in relation to Matthew. I'm talking about Mark.
Okay.
So
go ahead. But Papias was clearly wrong about that, is what I'm saying. I mean, demonstrably wrong.
Well,
would you agree with that?
I wouldn't, but we'll come to that after I talk about Mark.
Okay.
Okay. So Justin Martyr tells us that the apostles themselves composed memoirs, as I mentioned, which he says in his first apology in chapter 66 are also called Gospels.
Right.
And in his dialogue with Trypho, the Jewish rabbi, in chapter 106, which is, as you know, dated around.
Speak just a little slower because the electric glitch is kind of warping you out.
So he writes, and this is from his dialogue with Trypho in chapter 106. He says,
Gotcha.
And when it is said that he changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, and when it is written in the memoirs of him, that is Peter, that this so happened, as well as that he changed the names of the other two brothers, the sons of Zebedee, to Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Now, Justin says that in these memoirs of him, it is written that Jesus changed the name of one of the apostles to Peter, and also changed the name of the sons of Zebedee to Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. So what's interesting to note is that neither of these is found in the so-called Gospel of Peter, at least the extant fragment that we have of the Gospel of Peter. But both of them are, in fact, included in the Gospel of Mark. And the statement about calling the sons of Zebedee sons of thunder is found only in Mark in chapter 3, verse 17. And so since Papias also tells us that Mark was the interpreter of Peter, this suggests that the Mark being referred to by Papias is indeed our canonical Mark, which is the same one that Papias tells us about. Am I not right?
You're right as far as that you can take that evidence, but that's not the only interpretation, and that's naming when you say things like that. There's a clear. I've completely lost my train of thought. The Petrine influence is clearly delineated in what you're saying in the Gospel of Mark. That's wildly speculative, I would say, and there's better reason to think that there is no Petrine influence.
Okay, we'll have to agree to disagree on that, because I think there's
exactly. I mean, fair play,
but
and I apologize. It's very hard to hear what you're saying.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I feel like I'm missing half of what you're saying.
Okay, it's just because I think there was quite a good argument for Petrine influence on Mark because of both, but because not just one individual piece of evidence, but because of the convergence of internal and external indicators. So that's why I take that view. But you mentioned Matthew as well, and Papias, of course, does tell us, and this is where it gets a little trickier, because Papias does tell us that Matthew was, Matthew's gospel was written originally in the Hebrew or Aramaic dialect.
Right.
And he also refers to it as the so-called the oracles of the Lord, right?
Right, the Dominici, Logia Dominici, right?
I mean, I personally think of the four Gospels, the case for Matthean authorship of Matthew's Gospel is the weakest. But I would say, however, that, I mean, first of all, it's interesting to note that Matthew is attributed to a tax collector who were seen by the Jews as being treacherous. And so Matthew seems an unlikely choice if you're going to falsely attribute a Gospel.
Well, the funny thing is only one of them says there's Matthew and then there's Levi, and they become conflated as Matthew and Levi. So
you don't think Matthew and Levi are the same person?
I don't think it's necessarily the same person, no.
Okay. But
it also keeps in with the expectation that this is a guy who hung around with publicans and harlots. it's not that weird to think about, in the gospel context, especially in Mark, where he's constantly reversing the reader's expectations and, the first shall be last and that sort of thing.
Concerning concerning Papias and what he says of Matthew, I think this is quite consistent with what Papias says to suppose, and this is only speculation, but I think it's consistent, and I think it's consistent with Matthian authorship, is that Matthew wrote his gospel and then in the Hebrew dialect, and then it was expanded subsequently by someone potentially under Matthew's direction and translated into Greek. I'm not saying that.
You find that plausible? That seems wildly implausible to me, considering what we know about the synoptic problem and the fact that it's clearly a Greek, not just a Greek document, but something that's written in a Greek fashion by a well-educated Greek speaker.
Right. I think Matthew may well have been, probably was composed originally.
I'm sorry, and when I'm saying that, I'm talking about the original Mark. In addition to Matthew, it's not just that this is Greek. This is a story taken. He's taken Mark's story, clearly written in Greek, stylized in Greek, structured in Greek. It wasn't. It was very well thought out and put together. And Matthew is taking that and expanding on it.
Yeah, but
I don't think you can say that there's any kind of credence that you can say that somebody expanded Matthew under his dictation. That makes no sense to me at all.
Okay, I think that it's quite plausible. I mean, as I said, I think Matthew of the four Gospels is the weakest as to its authorship. I think that it's the weakest. But I think you can make a good case for Mark, at least, that it is.
I'm sorry. Hang on 2 seconds. Give it a second. Give it a second for the glitch to go past. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hello?
Can you hear me?
Hello?
Yep.
Say something now.
Hello?
I heard that.
Okay, great. I think for Mark, as I said, you can at least build a strong case that Mark is probably the author, because Mark is such an unlikely choice for gospel attribution, especially in view of the fact that
there's nothing in the gospel that says it's Mark. Nothing in the gospel says it's Mark.
But the second century church fathers are so unlikely to have attributed it to Mark had they not had good reason to think it was Mark, especially in view of...
Hold on. If you've already got somebody who's written a gospel of Peter, well, then you can't use Peter, but you can use Peter's secretary. He's a totally logical choice. When you have those second century gospels floating around and everyone's stealing up all the good names, Mark is not a bad choice at all.
But there were still. I mean, there are certainly apostles that, or individuals who seem like more. I mean, Mark is best known for abandoning Paul on a mission in Pamphylia, for example. So I mean,
well, all of them have their own faults. I mean, Peter's not a spotless one either. I mean, there's reasons for everyone choosing every name that we find gospels attached to in the second century, and not just gospels, but Acts and apocalypses and all the Christian writings that we find in the second century. You see them attached to one name or another. So it's silly to say, oh, they never would have done something like that. They did it multiple times in different settings.
Let me just ask you a question about John's gospel, just out of interest. So John's gospel, I would argue, I mean, Irenaeus tells us that John wrote his gospel. This is according to Against Heresies in volume 3, I think chapter 3, where he tells us that John wrote his gospel while resident at Ephesus. Now, we know that Ephesus is very close to Smyrna, which geographically in Asia Minor, and we know that Irenaeus, by his own testimony, was a disciple of Polycarp, and Polycarp, of course, lived in Smyrna and was a personal acquaintance of John the Apostle. And so it seems.
Hold on. I just want to point out that all those things you said are not necessarily true. First of all, those are attributed to them later in the second century. But go on.
Yeah.
I don't want to cut off your point.
Sure. I mean, are you contending that Irenaeus simply lied about having the relationship with Polycarp?
I'm not even sure Irenaeus said anything of the sort, to be honest with you. I'm certain that the attribution to John the Apostle for both of them and Polycarp was put on later.
Okay, so when Polycarp...
Let's talk about what you're saying now about what Irenaeus is saying about the Gospel of John. Because the Gospel of John doesn't say that it's written by John. points out very specifically that it's written by the disciple who Jesus loved, the beloved disciple.
Mm-hmm.
And when you compare the ways that that character appears in John's gospel to the synoptic gospels, it's very, very obvious that he's being inserted into an older story. For instance, you've got Peter running to the tomb, the empty tomb, to be the first one to see the Lord. Well, in the fourth gospel, it's him and the beloved disciple who get there, and the beloved disciple gets there first. You could go on at length about the different appearances of the beloved disciple in the other in the gospel, compared to the synoptics. But also, not only does it not say it's John, I mean, they had to do guesswork saying, well, it can't be, Matthew. It has to be one of the guys who was at the Garden of Gethsemane. It has to be one of the guys who was at the Transfiguration. They just did a guessing game and came up with John. But there's good reason to think that the original author of John, not the editors who came later and added other endings to it, not that makes a difference, but that originally intended for it to be Lazarus was.
Yeah, I know. I think, does Ben Witherington not make that point?
I don't know if he does or doesn't.
Someone makes that point. Yeah, I'm aware of the argument that it's Lazarus and not John the Apostle. The reason that most people take it to be John, I think, is because it is that John the Apostle is the only disciple not to be named in John's Gospel, and also and so the substitution for the one whom Jesus loved seems to make sense, and also. And it converges very well with what the external evidence is telling us from these early church fathers, especially in view of
when you say early church fathers, you're talking much late for Christianity. I mean, Papias is mid-second century.
But
that's over a century.
But Papias doesn't tell us that John wrote John's Gospel, so I'm not appealing to him. But Irenaeus was a companion of Polycarp, who knew John. But that's not the only argument.
Okay. Stop. When you say, and who knew John, we don't know that. That is not true.
Well, if you want to question his testimony...
Most of what we know about Polycarp, we know is not true.
As an historian, if you want to question what he's saying, you have to give me a good argument for why we should make him out to be a liar on that particular point.
Well, because we don't think Polycarp wrote that.
No, Polycarp didn't write that he knew John. We know this because Irenaeus and other people, including Jerome and Eusebius, tell us that
I'm well aware. Well aware that and that's what I'm saying. They are the ones making that attribution.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think there was an Apostle John. I don't think there was a beloved disciple.
Okay. The Gospel of John, I think, to just add another layer of evidence to the case for Johannine authorship, the Gospel of John also has very striking literary parallels to the Johannine epistles, which do attribute themselves to John the Apostle.
Yeah, but do biblical scholars think that they're the same author? They really don't.
I think there's
with Revelation.
I think it's very difficult to read the Johannine epistles and not come to the conclusion that we were dealing with the same author.
Well, I mean, I don't even want to get into that can of worms here, because that's also debated among biblical scholars, not just secular ones.
I mean, just to open First John, I mean, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, and so on. He speaks about in verse 1 still concerning the word of life, the life, and so it's just the thematic and literary parallels are very striking. Just read the epistles of John, and it just leaps out at you.
Honestly, that's not even my problem. I mean, I don't have a problem with the thought that those are connected. I don't have a problem with that the same author wrote both. I just don't think that's what happened. But it's no skin off my back if he did or didn't. I think it's a bigger problem that the beloved disciple is a fictional character, and when you compare him to the Synoptic Gospels, it's very obvious that he's a fictional character.
Can you give me some elaboration on that?
Yeah, and it's nothing I didn't say earlier. It's that when you compare where he shows up in the fourth gospel and then compare those same scenes in the earlier gospels, there's no appearance by him. He's been inserted in them, and he's inserted in a way to trump Peter, to make him the number one disciple.
And why can't John, being an eyewitness, note that he was himself there as well, whereas the other gospels don't make mention of that particular fact?
A, it's not written as an eyewitness. B, it's completely destroys the timeline of the other eyewitnesses, so-called eyewitnesses. and you've got later editors who've added things to it, and we can demonstrate that just by showing the 7 signs that they talk about and how many signs appear in between those signs. And the 2 endings that are slapped on top saying, oh, and this is the beloved disciple, and there's one who knows that he speaks the truth, so we know it too. There's all these different endings and re-edits to the Gospel of John.
Yeah, I mean, the point about the ending of John's Gospel, I mean, you're right. There's
endings. There's more than one.
Yeah, I know there's more than one in the end of John's Gospel. I mean, at the end of John 20, we read in verse 30 and 31, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples which are not written in this book, but these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, Son of God, and that by believing you might have life in his name. And you would think that would be the end of the Gospel.
Exactly.
And you turn the page and you get to John 21, and it sounds like after this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples.
Right.
And so on.
And it's the same thing at the Last Supper where he says, come, let's go now. And then he talks for another 2 or 3 chapters.
Right. But, I mean, these guys didn't have typewriters or computers. I mean, if they thought, I should have written this point and you've already written your conclusion, you continue writing. So I don't necessarily see that as being a problem.
Okay. I mean, I do, but I take your point.
But I mean, I don't necessarily see that as a problem. I don't see any stark literary differences between John 21 and the rest of John 20. But that's not really the point either. I mean, you don't necessarily see a difference in the endings of the original ending of Mark and the repeated ending of Mark, but actually you have 2 or 3 endings of Mark's to choose from. I agree.
They start having some theological implications there.
I agree that the ending of Mark is a forgery. I don't have a problem with that. I think there's really good evidence for that.
Yeah, and then more than one. There's more than one.
Yeah.
And again, I don't want to beat this to the ground, but as a non-Christian, the fact that this is supposedly all inspired by a Christian God who's supposedly or would seemingly be concerned that we get the story right doesn't do a very good job in his omnipotence of keeping the facts straight.
Well, I mean, okay, we're going to have to agree to disagree on that because we've been through these different contradictions that you allege already in this conversation. But
well, I mean, the fact that there's even questions at all about these endings that were tacked on later, parables that were put in long after the fact, like the story of the woman caught in adultery. Not a parable, of course.
Oh, yeah,
that wasn't originally part of that.
Yeah, the John 8 text about the woman caught in the act of adultery, there's, I think, some good reasons to think that is not in the original Johannine epistle, Johannine gospel, because, first of all, in different manuscripts, it seems to float about between gospels, which suggests that it's kind of looking for a home, which suggests that it's probably not in the original Johannine gospel.
Well, I mean, I totally agree with you, and I think it's clear that there's been additions and redactions, and there's no question of that in biblical circles for sure.
Yeah, I mean, the John 8, the ending of Mark, and a few other parts are among a small amount of the New Testament material that is in dispute as to its textual authenticity, as to whether.
When you say a small amount, I mean, honestly, a small amount is putting it mildly. Every single book in the New Testament, with the exception of the 6 genuine Pauline epistles, is either a forgery at best or forgery or at best anonymous.
Have you read William Paley's book on the authorship of the Pauline epistles? He makes some really powerful arguments for the authenticity of all of them.
Well, if you go to evangelical sources, you're going to get evangelical answers, but those aren't the only arguments out there.
Yeah, I'm aware of the arguments. I mean, I'd recommend highly reading William Paley's book, and William Paley, of course, being the famous Christian philosopher. Really, really powerful material based on the principle of undesignedness and relating the epistles of Paul to the book of Acts and showing by circuitous routes that it's unlikely to be the work of a forger. On pastorals, real quick, I am aware of some of the. There's clearly some differences in vocabulary and so on between some of the sort of non-disputed works of Paul and the pastorals, as you'll point out. What's interesting is that if you want to apply that argument consistently, you would also have to look at all the evidence, and I think one argument on the flip side of the coin, as far as the vocabulary is concerned, is in 1 Timothy 1, where you have the listing of the different sins. It says in verses 8, 9, 10, and 11, now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding this, that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners, for the unholy and profane, for those who strike their fathers and mothers, for murderers, the sexually immoral, men who practice homosexuality. Now, the Greek word that Paul uses here for homosexuality is arsenokoites, which is basically a compound word formed from two words in the Greek Septuagint translation of Leviticus 18 and Leviticus 20. Arsenos and koites literally means man better. Now, in
Man better?
Yeah, man better.
I love that. That's great.
1 Corinthians 6 is the other occurrence where this word appears in Paul's epistles. And basically, you have a very similar structure. He basically says if you do these particular sins, then you won't inherit the kingdom of God. And one of the sins he lists is arsenokoites. That word seems to be an invention of Paul himself. There's no evidence of its prior appearance in the Greek language before Paul.
I have to say using words particular to Paul is something a forger would do. It's not just the vocabulary that makes us think it's a forgery. It's also talking about structures that didn't exist during Paul's time. There's multiple reasons.
I disagree that the structure with overseers and deacons didn't exist during Paul's time. I think that's quite clear from the Book of Acts. The only reason I bring the point about arsenokoites up is that you can make these arguments from vocabulary differences, but you also have to look at the other side of the argument. If you're going to use that argument, you have to be consistent with that.
Well, and I take your point and I agree with you, but and again, at the end of the day, those aren't the only arguments, and those aren't even the best arguments. Okay. And when you say we know it because of Acts, when you compare Paul's genuine epistles, or even the fake ones for that matter, with Acts, every single thing that Paul says is contradicted by Acts, just about. Everything that Acts says that Paul did, he either specifically denies, or his time frame that he gives us completely throws it out the window.
I will say,
and again, as we know, Acts was probably written by the same guy who wrote Luke, long after Paul, long after the first.
There's a lot of points there. I will send you a PDF of William Paley's work on this, because it's absolutely brilliant on the relationship between the epistles of Paul and Acts, and I recommend highly reading it. Just one other point on the pastorals, and then I'll see if anyone else wants to mention anything, and then we'll close because I need to go. Okay. So 1 Timothy 5:18, for the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages," which of course. He says,
hold on. I'm sorry, you're breaking up. Stop. Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, can you give me that one more time?
Yeah. So 1 Timothy 5:18, for the scripture says, "You shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and the laborer deserves his wages."
Uh-huh.
Now, of course, he's quoting from Luke here, and it's obviously from Luke and not from some source that Luke also borrows from.
Wait. How do we know that? How do you know that?
Because he says, for the scripture says. And so he's clearly quoting from something which is regarded to scripture. Am I right?
Okay. The fact that somebody in that century would be referring to the Gospels as scripture is anachronistic, for starters. But I don't even know why I'm making a fuss, because clearly 1 Timothy was written after those books, Luke and Acts.
I disagree. I think that I don't necessarily see it as anachronistic. I think that it suggests that Luke was written far enough before 1 Timothy to be regarded as scripture, but I date Luke quite early, early 50s at least.
And again, I especially of all four Gospels, Luke is the one that I most feel strongest about, that we can make a good case that clearly that one was not written before the year 93 or 94 at the earliest.
And we've looked at that already, but I think 2 Corinthians 9:9, as it happens, the reason I brought this up is because 2 Corinthians 9:9 also quotes the same, I think it's 2 Corinthians 9:9. Or is it 1 Corinthians 9:9? Yeah, it's 1 Corinthians 9:9. He quotes the same passage that 1 Timothy had, for it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain, and so on. So he quotes the same scriptural text, which again, if you're going to apply these standards consistently, if you're going to look at the differences between the epistles, you also have to look at the similarities.
I totally agree.
Anyway, anyone else want to raise a point for David, or are we done? We have 30 messages while we were talking. So.
I just now started looking at some of the chat, and it's like, Krishnam Raju, screw you. He's saying some horrible shit on this chat here.
I see incidentally that Yusuf, I think it's Yusuf Ismail has joined. He's a leading Muslim scholar. I'm just curious as to his thoughts on, in fact, Yusuf has his hand up. Let me bring him in.
Hold on, I'm sorry, you glitched out again.
I was just saying Yusuf, I think it's Yusuf Ismail, had his hand up. He's a leading Muslim scholar, so I'm just interested in his...
Oh, let's talk to Yusuf.
Yusuf, how are you doing? You're muted 1 second. Okay, you're on.
Hello, David. How do you do?
Keith Halak, Yusuf.
Good today. I came in pretty late in the discussion, and so I'm not so sure where on the spectrum of historical Jesus studies you stand on. But one question I'd like to, know, and probably we could unpack it in the time that we have, is in fact the historicity of the crucifixion of Christ. A lot of biblical scholars who take a very deconstructive view on the New Testament would affirm the crucifixion as a historical fact. And my particular question to you would be, in light of the fact that, for example, the various gospel accounts provide different accounts of the Jewish role in Jesus's death. You find, for example, Mark and Matthew report 2 separate trials. Luke reports 1, John reports none. The Passion narratives themselves, there does not seem to be some sort of synchronicity. I just want to question what would be the factual approach that a historian in approaching the New Testament should adopt in respect or in regard to an event like the crucifixion, bearing in mind particularly that there doesn't seem to be a holistic synchronicity between all the Gospels in terms of how the crucifixion is in fact presented. Perhaps if you could kind of unpack that for us, and where you would stand on that specific spectrum.
Gotcha. Okay. You cut out a little bit towards the end there, but I think I got the gist of the question. You're saying something to the extent that how do we approach these claims in a historical context or a historical methodology?
Yes, absolutely.
Well, one thing we should start with is, if you're going to make any claim about anybody in history, what are your sources and how reliable are those sources? When we get to the Gospels, they make mistakes about the context of first century Judea. For instance, just a simple political situation of the Sadducees being in cahoots with the Pharisees. Nothing could be further from the truth. That's a total stereotype that all the Jews are evil, that was coming out of early Christianity later in the century and in the 2nd century. The trial of Jesus and the way the Romans behave, the way Pilate behaves, is nothing like we've heard from any reputable historical source about him, including Jewish sources. That he would always do the opposite of what the Jews begged him and never do what they begged him to do. And yet in the Gospels, he's just this warm dishwater welcome mat that just gets trowed over by the Jewish authorities. There's like the accounts of his trial are so in violation of what we know about ancient Judaic law that they dogpile up so fast you can barely keep track of all the problems that they present. That's where I want to start. It's not just the textual criticism of what are these sources, how are they dependent on each other, how are they different from each other, and showing the evolution of that story. But is this a story based on anything historical in the first place? And when we look at the way Christians talk about Jesus before the Gospels are written and the way they talk about him after, it seems very different. Now, as far as the crucifixion itself goes, when you first started talking, I thought you were going to be heading towards the swoon theory, that Christ was on the cross, but then he was either switched out with someone else, or that he only seemed to die and went on to live in Afghanistan or Srinagar, a long, happy life like the Ahmadiyya.
So that's a minority view. That's a minority view amongst the
right. But I kind of suspected you were going with that. The whole crucifixion of Christ seems to be predicated on the fact that they're creating a mystery faith, and their particular rising and Savior, dying Savior God, is one who was crucified, because that's what it said in Scriptures, because he was in there in the grave for 3 days because of the book of Noah. That was all really talking about that he would be living in the grave for 3 days. He'd die and then rise on the third day. And we have other motifs like that. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice and losing my mind as well. This has gone on for 3 hours, I just saw.
Okay, but if I could just interject here, and just to play the devil's advocate. If I were a Christian, for example, there were certain things that we need to question. How could they happen? According to Jewish law, a court cannot meet at night. It could not be on a major holiday. Jesus' statement to the Sanhedrin of the high priest don't constitute blasphemy. The charges that the Gospels make against they were not capital crimes against Jewish law.
So true.
All these things are found guilty. The point is that for all of that to happen, for all of what seems to be presented to happen in the Gospels, it wouldn't necessarily assume that Jewish leaders were scrupulously obedient to Roman law, and in fact never broke their own laws, customs, or even the traditions to that particular advantage. And some scholars would argue in response that the legal circumstances surrounding the trial of Christ may not have probably been that well understood, and therefore Jewish leaders were not always strictly obedient either to Roman law or their own particular law. That seems to be the argument coming forth from those who would.
And what I find interesting about that argument, is Yusef, is that we don't hear those arguments coming from early Christians, or even in the New Testament. We hear them arguing everything they know about Jesus. And this is especially true in the book of Acts. This is especially true in the epistles. Everything they do, they punt to the Septuagint. They punt to the Old Testament. They say that's how they know Jesus did this or did that, is because it's written according to Scriptures. And what that boils down to them is that he died for our sins on a cross, not always on a cross. He did 3 days, he rose again. And those are really the bare bones there, that there was a sacrificial death, just like all the other mystery faith gods at the time.
Would talk of the restoration of a Jewish monarchy be seditious under Roman occupation? Because that was a charge leveled against him in some capacity, particularly when the Romans were in fact approached by the Jews, that you have someone who's now coming about and creating a kingdom. Would that have been seditious in that particular context in the first century?
I suspect it would, but there's other reasons to think that the things that there are depicted as being seditious or potentially seditious, like Barabbas, that those are actually allegorical. And in the case of Barabbas, that it's an allegory for the Yom Kippur ritual that Jesus is replacing through his sacrifice.
Okay, so in finality then, in approaching the whole concept of the crucifixion, leaving aside the theological belief that people may have, historically speaking, and in fact in reference to extra-biblical material, could one conclusively state that in the first century we have a man called Jesus that was at some point in time crucified? Can one say that without a shadow?
I would say there was a belief in one. You could conclusively say there was a belief in one by the end of the first century, if not earlier. But to say there was an actual man, that seems very problematic to me. As I hope to make clear in the new book.
Okay. Well, I'm not familiar. I'd be interested in looking at the book that you were writing. The last point is that the post-crucifixion appearances, do to a certain extent, give some degree of, as some would argue, a justification to this whole so-called swooning theory. Particularly his post-crucifixion accounts give the indication that he's ever in disguise. The reaction of the Gospels in the upper room, in contrast to, for example, his appearance to Mary Magdalene in the Gospel of John, you find totally different reactions. So many argue from that perspective that possibly you have an indication of someone who may have survived the crucifixion. Do you see that as a plausible argument?
Robert Price does. Well, he does. He points it out that it seems there definitely seems to be a possibility that the original story did have him cheating death that way. And that's why you see some of the little asides in there. Or it could be that Mark is, again, just playing with our expectations and reversing them and making you think that, and then giving the whammy that, nope, he really did do these things. So that's at that point, it's very tough to say whether that was the original thing or not, because part of the problem is that we don't have the originals. We don't know what our New Testament text originally said.
So how does one interpret a passage where it says, for example, in the upper room, a spirit has no flesh and bones as you see me have, when presenting himself to his disciples in Luke's gospel? He particularly says that when there's an assumption.
Everything in the Gospels, he said, it is given to the fact that there was a guy and he came down to earth and lived amongst us. We don't see that before the Gospels are written.
Okay, so your response to that would be, the point I want to know is, how does one interpret Luke 24:36 as an example? How does one interpret that?
Anything based on the Gospels, you're talking about the point when Jesus went from being purely mythological to being allegorical and historical. That trend started with Mark's Gospel.
Which was the earliest Gospel, as I understand. You subscribe to Mark and Parody.
Yes.
That would be the earliest Gospel. Yeah.
Yes.
So if someone would argue, for the sake of argument, that the post-crucifixion appearances do give an indication or presentation of a Christ that very much cheated death or survived the attempt on his life, that would not necessarily be an implausible argument.
I think, I would hesitate to say that that's clearly the case, but it's certainly, you can make the argument that there's a trope that's there. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that.
We should probably close up pretty soon because I need to go. But
well, thanks to everybody who had me on. And again, I'm not saying this to bag on you guys, your religion. I'm just giving where I'm coming from, and if I'm wrong, I'm very happy to change my mind. I have done before. I will again. So I'm looking forward to hearing more from all of you.
Yeah, if we were the type of people that would be offended by criticizing our religion, we wouldn't have had you on. So.
Exactly. All right. Shanae, amen. All right.
Thank you, David. That was very brave of you coming into the lion's den, as it were.
That metaphor was not lost on me. Am I become your enemy because I tell you the truth? All right. Good night, all. Thanks again for having me.
Well, take care. Bye.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you.